Hey there, story lovers. This is Harry Reality Bender, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. What if Lily Potter's secret diary taught Harry ancient blood runes at age 6 and he created his own faction? Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Diary Under the Floor. The crack in the floorboard was 3 inches long and shaped like a bolt of lightning. Harry had noticed it 2 years ago, when he was 4 and small enough that the cupboard under the stairs felt almost like a room if he didn't think too hard about it. He'd traced it with his finger in the dark, that jagged little split in the wood, and thought it was the most interesting thing in the house. Which, given that the house belonged to the Dursleys, wasn't saying much. He was 6 now, and he'd long since catalogued every crack, every spider web, every water stain on the cupboard's low ceiling. He knew which shelf wobbled if you put weight on the left side. He knew the exact pitch of Vernon's footsteps versus Dudley's. Vernon was a flat-footed thud-thud-thud, Dudley a kind of charging gallop that shook the whole staircase. He knew these things the way a prisoner knows his cell, which was more or less exactly what it was. It was a Tuesday in October when the floorboard moved. Harry hadn't touched it. He'd been lying on his cot reading a geography textbook he'd rescued from Dudley's discard pile. Dudley discarded everything, which meant Harry ate better intellectually than he did physically, and the board simply shifted, like something beneath it had sighed. A thin line of darkness appeared along one edge. He put the textbook down. He stared at the board for a long moment, the way he always stared at strange things, which was the way a cat watches a bird through glass, very still, very patient, and not at all uncertain about what it intended to do next. He pressed his fingers to the edge and lifted. It came up easily, as if it had been waiting. Beneath it, in a hollow that must have been deliberately carved out of the subfloor, the edges were too clean, too deliberate for accident, sat a small package wrapped in dark green cloth. The cloth had some kind of symbol stitched into it in silver thread, a design Harry didn't recognize, 2 lines crossing through a circle, with small marks radiating outward like spokes that weren't quite symmetrical. He reached in and took it out. The cloth was softer than anything in the house. Harry knew every texture in number 4, Privet Drive, and none of them felt like this. It was almost warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight, except the cupboard got no sunlight at all. He unwrapped it carefully, and found a book. It was the size of a school exercise book but thicker, bound in deep red leather that had gone soft with age. There was no title on the cover. On the first page, in handwriting that was quick and a little slanted and clearly belonged to someone who wrote fast because their thoughts moved faster, were 4 lines. Lily J. Potter née Evans. This is a working journal, not a diary. Don't be dramatic if you're reading this, you're probably Harry. Hello, love. Harry sat very still for a very long time. Then he turned to page 2. Hello, love. She'd written it so casually, like she'd just stepped out of the kitchen and expected him to be right there. Like no time had passed. Like she hadn't been dead for 5 years. Harry had almost no memories of his mother. He had one image, red hair, and a feeling of warmth, and green eyes that he only recognized as similar to his own because Mrs. Figg had once shown him a photograph by accident and then immediately taken it back, flustered, while Harry filed the image away with the careful precision he applied to everything. He had her eyes. He'd known that much. He had not known she had her handwriting. If you're reading this, you're probably Harry, she'd written, because I've keyed the compartment to our family bloodline. If Petunia found it, she'd have gotten a mild electric shock and a headache. Serves her right, frankly. I love my sister but she can be deeply awful. You probably know this better than I do. I'm writing this when you're 14 months old. You're asleep upstairs. Your father is pretending to review Aura reports but actually he's been reading the same page for 40 minutes because he keeps watching you breathe. He thinks I don't notice. I notice everything. He knows I notice. We've reached a comfortable arrangement about it. There's a chance, I hope I'm wrong, I'm trying very hard to be wrong, that you're reading this without me. That things went badly and you ended up at Petunia's. I've been trying to work out how to make sure you're okay if that happens, and the best thing I can think of is to leave you what I know. Which is quite a lot, as it turns out. I'm a blood rune scholar. Not many of us left. The field got stigmatized during Grindelwald's time because he used runework for some genuinely horrifying things, and everyone threw the subject out along with him. Which was lazy scholarship, and I've said so in print, though not under my real name because your father worried about my safety, and honestly he wasn't wrong. What I've figured out, what I've been building for the last 3 years, is a system. A way of understanding magical energy that's different from what they teach at Hogwarts. Hogwarts is good at what it does. But it teaches you to aim outward, point the wand, push the power away from you. My system works differently. It starts with what's inside you. Your own magical signature. Your core. The thing that makes your magic yours and not anyone else's. I'm going to teach you. Slowly, in stages, because you're going to be growing while you read this, and I've tried to account for that. Start at the beginning. Don't skip ahead, I know you'll want to, you're my son, but trust the sequence. Some of these concepts build on each other in ways that matter. Oh, and Harry. I'm very proud of you. I haven't seen you do anything yet that would justify it. But I know you. I made you. And I'm proud. Harry closed the diary. He opened it again immediately and read those 4 pages 3 more times. Then he dried his eyes with the back of his hand, which took longer than he would have liked, and turned to the next section. The system Lily Potter had developed over 3 years of research and then compressed into a teaching manual for a child she hoped would never need it was called, in her notes, Ancient Blood Rune Craft, though she added in a parenthetical that the name was a bit grand and she'd considered signature magic, but it sounded like a post office. The core idea, as Harry understood it across the next 3 weeks of reading and rereading, was this: every magical person had a unique energetic signature embedded in their blood and magic. Standard magic, the wand and incantation variety, was essentially generic. The wand helped shape and project power, but the power itself was largely undifferentiated. Lily's theory was that magic used in alignment with a person's specific signature was dramatically more efficient, more powerful, and more precise than standard casting. The runes were the alphabet of that alignment. They weren't the Norse runes taught in Hogwarts' 3rd year, or the Egyptian hieroglyphic-adjacent symbols used in some healing traditions. They were a specific subset of what Lily called living runes, symbols that, when inscribed with a drop of the caster's blood, became tuned to that caster's signature. Inert on anyone else's skin. Active, responsive, and permanent on theirs. Think of it like a key, she'd written. A regular spell is like trying to open every lock with a skeleton key. It mostly works. My system cuts a key that fits exactly one lock, yours. It goes in perfectly. It doesn't jam. It doesn't need force. It just opens. Harry had read that passage 7 times. Each time it felt more true. The first exercise Lily outlined was not a spell at all. It was observation. She asked him, and the way she'd written it, warm and direct, it genuinely felt like being asked, to find a very small flame source. A candle. A match. Something with a real fire, not an electric light. Watch it, she'd written. Don't try to do anything with it. Just watch. Pay attention to what you feel when you look at it. Not emotionally, physically. Does your palm feel warmer? Does there seem to be a kind of pressure behind your sternum? Does the air between you and the flame feel different from the air beside you? These aren't fancy magical phenomena. They're you noticing your own magical field responding to an external source of energy. Everyone can do this. Nobody teaches them to look. Harry had stolen a candle from the kitchen cabinet and spent 4 evenings watching it in the dark of the cupboard, very carefully not getting caught. By the 3rd evening, he'd found it, a faint warmth in his chest, a kind of vibration behind his ribs that seemed to resonate when he looked at the flame. It wasn't big. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real, and it was his, and it was something he'd found entirely on his own by simply paying attention. He'd felt, at that moment, something he didn't have adequate words for. He'd felt it was possible that everything was going to be all right. He wrote nothing in the diary. Lily had left blank pages in sections she labeled your notes, and he was terrified to mark them, to make permanent something in the only thing he had of her. So he wrote on the inside of the geography textbook's back cover instead, in his smallest handwriting, and he wrote, "Found it. Chest, slightly left of center. Warm. Constant. Mine." Aunt Petunia noticed, that winter, that something was different about Harry. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, with suspicion first, analysis second, and a default interpretation of malice. Harry had always been an odd child, too quiet, too watchful, with those unnerving green eyes that she tried not to think about because they reminded her of Lily, and she had a lot of feelings about Lily that she'd organized into a small tight box and sealed shut. But lately he'd been more odd. He did his chores without being asked. He sat at dinner without fidgeting. He watched Vernon's rages from across the room with an expression that was not, Petunia realized with a creeping discomfort she couldn't name, frightened. He looked almost interested. "What are you staring at?" Vernon barked at him one evening, over a dinner where Harry had been given the leftover bits of some pasta and was eating them with the focused patience of a monk. "I'm not staring," Harry said. "Don't talk back." "I wasn't talking back. I was answering your question." The silence that followed was the kind that crackled. Vernon went red. Petunia went white. Dudley kept eating because Dudley always kept eating. Harry looked at his pasta. Something about the quality of his stillness, not submission, not defiance, just a kind of complete centeredness, made Vernon's bluster stall before it fully launched. The man's mouth worked for a moment without producing sound. He eventually made a noise that was probably meant to be a warning growl and went back to his dinner. In the cupboard that night, Harry wrote in the textbook, "Being genuinely unafraid is different from pretending to be unafraid. I think he can tell. I think that's why it works." He turned to his mother's diary. He was on page 47 now, and she was getting into the actual rune forms. "The first rune you'll learn is called Ain, which I'm transliterating from the original script because it's easier to write. Ain means anchor. Its function is to stabilize your magical output, to give your magic a fixed point of reference, so it doesn't bleed outward wastefully when you're not actively casting. Most untrained magical children lose significant amounts of ambient magic just through emotional resonance. You've probably noticed things happening around you when you're upset or frightened. Ain stops the bleed. It also, secondarily, makes you much harder to magically detect, since your signature stops broadcasting. To inscribe it, you'll need a clean surface. Your own forearm is ideal for the first one, something sharp enough to draw a small bead of blood, and focus. The physical inscription is done in blood. It will hurt a little. I'm not going to pretend it won't. But I'll tell you something true, the magic doesn't care about the pain. The pain is just the door. Walk through it." Harry had held the diary for a long time after reading that. Then he'd looked at his arm. Then he'd found a sewing needle in Aunt Petunia's mending basket, cleaned it with some rubbing alcohol he'd taken from the bathroom cabinet, and spent 2 hours very carefully learning to draw the symbol that his mother had sketched out across 3 careful diagram pages, with arrows and annotations in her quick handwriting. It wants to look like a cross, but it isn't a cross, the lines aren't equal, the lower stroke is slightly longer. Think of it as a person standing on the earth with their arms out. The marks at the ends of each stroke are important. Don't skip them. They're the part that matters. The first attempt bled more than he'd expected and the marks came out wobbly. He'd wiped it clean and started again. The second attempt was better. The third felt, somehow, right, not because it looked perfect but because something clicked when he finished the final stroke, like a door closing softly in a room he hadn't known was drafty. The ambient magic stopped bleeding. He hadn't fully noticed how much of it there'd been until it stopped. It was like taking off a coat you'd been wearing so long you forgot it was there. Lighter. More contained. More his. He'd slept better that night than he had in years. The next 2 years passed in a rhythm that Privet Drive would have found incomprehensible if it had known. Harry did his chores. He went to school. He absorbed everything his teachers said, which was more than most of his classmates bothered to do, though he was careful about how much he demonstrated this because he'd learned early that Dudley didn't like being made to look slow, and Dudley had fists and several friends who also had fists. Harry was not afraid of Dudley. But he was strategic about him. At night, he read. He practiced. He filled the inside covers of discarded textbooks with notes in his smallest handwriting, observations and questions and discoveries. Lily's diary didn't just contain the rune system. It contained her opinions about ministry politics, sharp and frequently correct, as Harry would come to understand, her theory that the magical world's over-reliance on one craft had stunted the development of several entire branches of magic, her observations about Dumbledore, admiring and wary in equal measure. He is one of the great ones, but great ones always think they can see the whole board. Nobody can see the whole board. Her notes on the Potter family history, which was considerably more interesting than Harry had expected. Her memories of Hogwarts, her first experiments with the rune system, her excitement that vibrated off the page even through years and death. He loved her. It was a strange kind of love, loving someone through their handwriting, through the particular way she made her G's and the small sardonic asides she left in margins. But it was real. He loved her ideas and her precision and the fact that she'd clearly been as unable to leave a question alone as he was. He loved that she'd built something and left it for him. He learned 4 more runes in his 7th year. Knave, which she called the shield, not a physical barrier but a kind of magical dampener that redirected hostile magical energy rather than blocking it, like a sloped surface sending rain sideways. Kale, the sight rune, which attuned his perception to magical fields and let him, with practice, see the rough shape of magic in objects and spaces. Thorn, the focus rune, which concentrated his magical output for precise work. And ELD, which Lily had marked with a small star and the note, "Save this one for when you're older. You'll know when." He did not use ELD. He was patient about it. The Kale rune changed things most dramatically, because it meant that when he looked at the world, he could see more of it. Not visually, not like a superhero. More like having a new sense that operated alongside his regular ones. Objects with magical properties had a faint luminescence at the edge of his perception. Spaces where magic had been worked recently felt textured, like running your fingers across a surface and feeling where something had happened. People, magical people, though he hadn't met many, had signatures, faint and unique, like different instruments in an orchestra. He'd used it, once, on Mrs. Figg, who was not as muggle as she appeared. Her signature was old and very faint, like a radio station almost out of range. Squib, he guessed, and filed it away. She was kind to him in a limited, slightly guilty way, and he'd decided she was worth protecting. Not telling, but protecting. He'd used it on Dudley once, out of curiosity, and got nothing at all. Dudley was relentlessly, comprehensively non-magical, which Harry privately felt was just as well. He used it on Aunt Petunia one morning when she was in the garden, and got a flicker of something so small and so quickly suppressed that he wasn't sure it was real. He thought about that for a long time. When Harry was 8, he did something with the runes that wasn't in Lily's diary. It happened accidentally, which is how most significant things happen. He was in the backyard, theoretically weeding the garden, a task he'd been given with no specific supervision because Petunia was inside on the phone and Vernon was at work and Dudley was at a friend's house dismantling something. He was going through the motions of weeding while actually running through the Knave rune's logic in his head, trying to understand something that had been bothering him. The rune redirected magical energy, but what determined which direction it redirected it to? He pressed his thumb to the Knave inscription on his inner wrist, a habit he'd developed, a kind of focusing gesture, and thought about the mechanism. Lily's explanation was that it followed the path of least resistance, like water finding a downhill slope. But that implied there was always a downhill slope, always a pre-existing direction. What if, he thought, you created the direction? He looked at the weeds. Without really deciding to, he let the thought become intent, and let the intent connect to the thorn rune, focus, precision, concentration, and then pushed, very gently, through the nave redirect he'd mentally aimed at the weed's root structure. The weed came out of the ground cleanly, root and all, with a faint sound like a small sigh, and landed in his palm. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the rest of the garden. He spent the next 40 minutes methodically removing every weed from the Desley garden without touching any of them, using a combination of nave and thorn that he was inventing as he went. The work had a quality to it that nothing else in his daily life had, a kind of perfect flow where the thinking and the doing were the same thing, where the problem and the solution existed in the same moment. He was 9 before he fully understood what he'd done. He'd combined 2 runes into a network, with himself as the conducting node. Lily's diary hadn't taught this. There were hints of it in later sections, notes that suggested she'd theorized about rune combinations, but she hadn't developed it fully. She'd run out of time. He kept going. By age 10, he had a working vocabulary of 9 runes, 3 original combination networks he'd developed himself, and a theoretical framework for the system that had grown past his mother's notes and into his own territory. He'd had to start writing in actual notebooks by then. The textbook margins weren't enough, and he had 2 of them, hidden in the same subfloor compartment where the diary lived, covered in his increasingly confident handwriting. The notebooks were not, strictly speaking, a diary. They were a working journal. Not a diary, don't be dramatic. He'd smiled for 10 minutes the first time he wrote that. Hagrid came on a Tuesday. Harry was in the kitchen making breakfast. This was his job every morning, and he did it well enough that Petunia had stopped complaining about it, which was the closest thing to a compliment she was capable of, when he felt it. The Kale rune lit up like a struck bell. It was a magical signature unlike anything he'd encountered before, huge, warm, dense with old wild magic that felt like the first moment before a thunderstorm. It was coming up the walk. Harry set the spatula down, turned off the burner, and waited. The knock on the door was less of a knock and more of a small structural event. The entire door frame shook. Petunia shrieked from upstairs. Vernon stampeded down the hallway. Dudley appeared at the top of the stairs looking like he'd swallowed something that surprised him. Harry watched Vernon open the door. The man filling the doorway was enormous, not just tall but broad, with a wild dark beard and kind eyes that were currently doing rapid evaluations of the hallway interior. He wore a moleskin overcoat the size of a tent. He carried an umbrella that seemed slightly too large even for him. His eyes found Harry. "Harry," he said, and his voice was like somebody had put warmth into a sound wave. "Last time I saw ya, we're just a baby." "Hello," Harry said. Vernon turned an unpleasant color. "Now see here, Rubius Hagrid," the large man said, without looking at Vernon, still looking at Harry. "Keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts School o' Witchcraft and Wizardry. I've got your letter." He held it out. It was thick cream parchment, sealed in green wax with an emblem Harry recognized from Lily's diary, the Hogwarts seal. Harry took it. He didn't tear it open. He looked at Hagrid for a moment, at the warmth in that huge face, at the slightly careful way Hagrid was watching him, like he'd been worried and now the worry was shifting shape rather than leaving. "She told me about you," Harry said. "In her notes. She said you carried me out of the house." Hagrid's face did something complicated. Yevi got her notes. I found her diary when I was 6. Under the floorboard." He paused. "She said you were the best kind of person." Hagrid made a sound that was not entirely unlike a large animal attempting to be quiet and failing. He rubbed at his beard with one massive hand. Vernon was spluttering something about freaks and not in this house, but nobody was paying attention to Vernon. "I'm glad ya found it," Hagrid said, a bit thickly. "I am too," Harry said. He opened the letter. The letter was what he'd expected from Lily's descriptions, supply lists, boarding information, the standard note that books could be purchased at Flourish and Blots, which he'd never visited but felt oddly acquainted with from Lily's mentions of it. He read it with the focused speed of someone who actually reads rather than schemes and then folded it neatly. Vernon, by this point, had worked himself into a significant rage about freaks and abnormality and the perfectly normal reputation of the Dursley household, which he seemed to feel was a form of social capital on par with gold bullion. Petunia had come downstairs and was standing in the kitchen doorway doing the particular version of her face that meant she was frightened but had decided to translate the fear into hostility. Harry had not stopped looking at Hagrid. Hagrid, to his credit, was handling the Dursleys the way a large confident dog handles annoying small noise, patiently, without engagement, waiting for it to stop. "I'll get my things," Harry said, when Vernon paused for breath. "You will not, I have one bag and a few books," Harry said, still talking to Hagrid. "It won't take long." He went to the cupboard under the stairs and began, for the first time, packing. He put in the geography textbook with its covered margins. He put in the 2 notebooks. He wrapped the diary in its dark green cloth, still warm, always warm, and placed it at the very bottom of the bag, against the back corner, the safest possible spot. He stood in the cupboard doorway for a moment, looking at the cot, the single shelf, the crack in the floorboard shaped like a bolt of lightning. He pressed 2 fingers to the floorboard. Closed. "Goodbye." He picked up his bag and walked back down the hall. Hagrid was sitting on the floor because there was no furniture that would hold him, producing an enormous fruit cake from somewhere within his coat, which Dudley had apparently already started on despite being told not to. He'd given Dudley a pig's tail at some point in the last 3 minutes, which Harry noted with a sense that Hagrid was perhaps more direct than Lily's notes had suggested. "Ready?" Hagrid asked him. "Yes," Harry said. He did not say goodbye to the Dursleys. He considered it and decided it was not precisely accurate. He would not miss them. He did not wish them ill. They were simply a place he had been, and now he was going somewhere else. Petunia called after him from the doorway, something brittle and half-formed. Harry paused on the garden path and turned back. In the morning light, she looked older than he expected, and something in her face was almost a different thing than he was used to seeing there, not quite regret, not quite grief, but something in that territory. He thought about the faint magical flicker he'd felt from her, once, years ago. "She loved you," he said. "She mentioned you a lot in her notes. She said you were brilliant at chemistry and that she always thought you'd have been good at it, at magic. The science of it. She thought it was unfair you didn't get to try." Petunia's face crumpled through approximately 4 different expressions in 2 seconds. Harry turned back to the path. "Come on, then," he said to Hagrid, and meant it entirely. Diagon Alley was, structurally speaking, impossible. Harry had understood this before arriving. Lily's diary had included a section on wizarding space expansion charms and the specific enchantments used on the Leaky Cauldron's back wall passage. But knowing it intellectually and walking through the brick archway while Kale lit up like the sky on Guy Fawkes' night were different things. The magical density of the place was extraordinary. Every surface had been touched by decades of enchantment. Every building had its own layered signature. People moved through the crowd with magical fields that hummed and overlapped and separated again. It was like walking into an orchestra mid-performance, except you could feel every instrument through your skin. Harry kept his pace steady and his face neutral and filed approximately 40 things away per minute. Hagrid was an excellent guide, enthusiastic, enormously well-liked judging by the frequency of hails and waves he received, and genuinely delighted by Harry's evident interest in everything. "Mum took me through your notes, actually," Harry said, while they waited at a crossing for a wizard on an enchanted bicycle to navigate a stack of levitating parcels. "The section on Gringotts. She said the goblin accounting system was more sophisticated than the ministry's." Hagrid looked startled. "She said that?" "She had strong opinions about the ministry's organizational failures." Harry paused. "She had strong opinions about a lot of things." "She did," Hagrid agreed, and his voice was fond and a little raw. "Best student Hogwarts had in her year. And the year before, some would say, and the one before that. She saw things, you know. Saw how things worked and then she'd poke at 'em till she figured out how to make 'em work better. Harry looked at the front of Gringotts ahead of them, white marble gleaming in the London autumn sun. "I know," he said. The goblin at the front desk processed their entry with the detached efficiency of someone who'd long since stopped being impressed by wizards. Hagrid presented a small key and a letter from Dumbledore, and they were escorted, rattled, really, on a cart that moved with the contained enthusiasm of a roller coaster that had stopped apologizing for itself, down to Vault 687. Lily's vault, as it turned out. A secondary Potter account, separate from the main trust vault. Harry looked at the inside of it for a moment. There was gold, a reasonable amount, and several sealed boxes that had names written on them in Lily's handwriting, and a folded letter at the very front, addressed in familiar quick script. "For when you need it. You'll know." He took the gold he needed for his school supplies. He looked at the boxes for a long moment. He left them. "You'll know." "Not yet, then." The wand shop was the last stop, and Harry had been looking forward to it with the specific quality of attention he applied to things that were likely to be significant. Ollivander's was narrow and dust-dark and smelled of sawdust and old magic. The magical density here was different from the street, layered, precise, patient. Thousands of individual signatures, sleeping in their boxes. The Kale rune mapped them the way sonar maps a seafloor. Ollivander appeared between shelves with the particular quality of motion that suggested he'd been there all along and the room had simply noticed him. "Mr. Potter," he said. His pale eyes went to Harry's forehead first, the scar, and then dropped to Harry's eyes. Something in his expression shifted. "I wondered when I'd see you." "You knew my mother," Harry said. It wasn't quite a question. "I knew her wand. 10¼ inches. Willow. Swishy, excellent for charms. She wandered the shelves for an hour and 40 minutes before it chose her." He paused. "She was the most thorough customer I've ever had. She asked more questions than any young witch or wizard before or since, I believe. She kept notes." "She always kept notes," Harry said. Ollivander measured him with a tape measure that moved independently, while Ollivander himself watched Harry's face with those strange pale eyes. "Holly," Ollivander said, pulling boxes. 11 inches. Phoenix feather core. The wand felt, when Harry picked it up, like completing a circuit. The warmth was immediate and familiar, not like the rune warmth, which was internal and quiet, but like two things that belonged together finding each other after being in different drawers. His magical signature and the wand's resonated and aligned, and he felt the wave of it move all the way to his feet. He made a careful spiral in the air. A cascade of gold and scarlet sparks followed it, filling the narrow shop with light. Ollivander said nothing for a long moment. "Curious," he said at last. "Very curious." "The phoenix that gave the feather," Harry said. "It gave another?" "Yes. Your wand is a brother to another, the one that gave you that scar." Those pale eyes held his steadily. "I wonder what it means, that brothers have come together again." Harry looked at the wand in his hand. "It means," he said, "that it's a good wand." He paid the 7 galleons and put the wand in his bag next to Lily's diary, and when they stepped back out onto Diagon Alley, Hagrid was looking at him with an expression that was half affection and half something that might have been awe. "Yerry a lot like her," Hagrid said. Harry almost said "I know" and then didn't, because it wasn't quite true. He was like her in the ways he'd chosen to be, the ways he'd learned from her notes and her voice on the page and the quality of mind she'd left encoded in her work. But he was also something she hadn't been, because he'd had different information and different time and different fires to be tested in. "I hope so," he said instead. "I'm trying to be." Hagrid smiled at that, large and warm and genuine. They walked back through the leaky cauldron and into Muggle London, and Harry thought about the train ticket in his bag, and platform 9¾ and what came next. He thought about 9 runes inscribed in his own blood, singing quietly against his skin. He thought about his mother's voice in clean blue ink across soft red pages. She'd built a system and left it for him. He'd built it further. Now he was going to see what it could do. Chapter 2, The Boy They Didn't Know. The summer before Hogwarts was the hottest in a decade, according to the radio that Vernon kept at maximum volume in the living room as if the weather report was personally insulting him. Harry spent most of it in the backyard, which was a calculated choice. The Dursleys didn't like being outside, so outside was where he had the most room. He'd pushed the garden furniture to one end and cleared a flat space on the lawn, and every morning between 6 and 8, before Petunia came down to start breakfast and before the heat became oppressive, he worked. The work looked, from a distance, like a child sitting cross-legged on the grass doing nothing. Dudley had observed it once from an upstairs window and reported to Vernon that Harry was being weird again, which was sufficiently vague to cover most of Harry's activities and therefore not actionable. Vernon had made a noise and turned up the radio. What Harry was actually doing was running a full diagnostic of his rune network. He'd developed the diagnostic practice over the last year, after he'd noticed that the rune's effectiveness varied with his physical and mental state. Tired, the runes were duller. Stressed, the knave redirect tried to fire at nothing and wasted energy. After a night of bad dreams, and there were still bad dreams, occasional, brief, a flash of green light and a woman's scream that he couldn't locate in any specific memory, the Ain anchor wobbled like a table with one short leg. The diagnostic was simple in concept, complex in execution. He'd trace each rune in his mind, check its resonance against his current signature, adjust for any drift. It took about 40 minutes and left him feeling calibrated in a way that he had no good non-magical metaphor for. Clean, maybe. Like the magical equivalent of stretching before a run. While he ran the diagnostic, he thought about the diary. He'd read it through completely twice now. The second reading had been different from the first, slower, more technical, with his notebooks open alongside it, cross-referencing Lily's theoretical framework against the developments he'd made in the years since. She'd been right about most things. She'd been incomplete on several, which wasn't a criticism. She'd said herself that the system was unfinished. And there were 3 places where she'd been, in Harry's working opinion, wrong. Not wrong in her findings, wrong in her assumptions about how far the system could go. The clearest example was her treatment of rune combinations. She'd theorized about them, noted them as a direction for future research, and then concluded, in a brief paragraph that Harry had read approximately 30 times, that combinations of more than 2 living runes in a single network would likely be unstable without an external stabilizing medium, such as a prepared ritual space or a specially enchanted object. Harry had been running stable 3-rune combinations for 2 years. The secret, and he'd figured this out slowly, empirically, through a series of increasingly precise experiments that had occasionally resulted in small fires and once a very startled garden spider, was that the instability wasn't in the combination. It was in the transition between runes. Lily had been linking them end to end, like a chain. Harry had worked out that if you structured them as a triangle, with each rune supporting the other 2, the load was distributed and the stability was dramatically better. 4 runes could be structured as a diamond. 5 as a pentagon. The geometry, he'd realized, wasn't metaphorical, it was the actual mechanism. He'd written this up in careful detail in his second notebook, with diagrams. He'd then written at the top of the page, in his cleanest handwriting, "Mom, I think I found something. I hope you'd have liked it." The owl arrived on a Thursday in July, which was not especially significant, except that Harry had been expecting it and had left his bedroom window open the previous 3 nights in preparation. It was a barn owl, school registry standard, carrying a follow-up notice from Hogwarts about the platform 9 3/4 departure time and a reminder about the ban on first-years bringing their own broomsticks. Harry read both notices, made a note about the broomstick rule, not because he intended to violate it but because rules you know are more useful than rules you don't, and fed the owl a biscuit from the small supply he'd been accumulating for exactly this purpose. Petunia had appeared in the doorway during this, and then left without saying anything. This was something she'd been doing lately, appearing, observing, disappearing. It was different from her usual quality of presence, which was surveillance-flavored. This felt more like she was checking on something, though Harry couldn't determine what. He thought about what he'd said to her on the garden path, on the morning Hagrid came. She loved you. He'd meant it. Lily had mentioned Petunia frequently, with a complicated warmth that survived even exasperation. He didn't know if it had been the right thing to say. He'd said it because it was true, and he generally found that true things were worth saying regardless of their reception. He thought about the magical flicker he'd felt from her. "Aunt Petunia," he said, from his doorway. She stopped at the top of the stairs and turned very slowly, as if bracing for something. "Did you ever want to go?" he asked. "To Hogwarts. When you were young. Did you ever want to be magical?" The silence lasted long enough to be an answer by itself. "That's none of your business," she said finally. "I know," Harry said. "I'm sorry I asked." He paused. "I'm not asking for any reason. I'm not going to use it against you or tell anyone. I've been reading her notes for 4 years. And she talked about you like you were brilliant. She thought you were brilliant. I just wondered if you knew that." Petunia turned away and went downstairs, and didn't speak to him again for a week. But that evening, when he came down for dinner, there was a slice of cake on his plate, proper cake, not leftover bits of something, and no explanation given. He ate it and said nothing. Some things didn't need to be named. He spent the last 3 weeks before September 1st working on what he'd been privately calling the ELD rune. The one Lily had starred. "Save this one for when you're older. You'll know when." He was 11. He didn't know if that was old enough. But he'd been staring at the ELD description for a year now, and he'd done every preparatory exercise Lily had outlined in the surrounding pages, and every diagnostic suggested his network was stable enough to hold it. And he kept coming back to what it did. Lily called it the resonance rune. Its function, as she described it, was to extend a person's magical signature outward in a controlled way, not broadcasting it, the way untrained magic did, but offering it. A voluntary extension. A bridge. ELD was what made connection possible. Without it, your signature was yours alone. With it, you could, if another person was also carrying ELD, create a link. Not mind reading. Not control. She was explicit about this, emphatic in a way that suggested she'd anticipated the concern. It was more like 2 tuning forks placed near each other. When one resonated, the other felt it. When one was in distress, the other knew. This is what the system is ultimately for, she'd written, and Harry could feel the weight she'd put in those words. Not personal power. Not individual mastery. Those are means. This is the purpose. Magic that connects instead of divides. Magic that says, "I am here, and you are not alone." She'd intended to build this with his father. She hadn't had time. Harry looked at his arm, at the small neat marks of 8 runes in faded brown ink, and thought about what she'd wanted to build and the fact that she couldn't. And he thought about Hogwarts in 3 weeks, about a castle full of people he hadn't met yet, about the system he'd spent 4 years developing in a cupboard under the stairs, and he thought, "I'm going to do it for you." He inscribed ELD on a Thursday afternoon, with the sun coming through his bedroom window at an angle that made the whole room golden. He was more careful with this one than any of the others, slow, precise, with the full weight of his focus behind every stroke. When he finished the last mark, the resonance was immediate and unmistakable, a warmth that went through his whole arm and into his chest and settled next to the Ain anchor like something that had been waiting for its place. He sat with it for a long time. Then he opened his notebook and wrote, "Ready." He met Neville Longbottom because of a toad. He was on platform 9 3/4, which he'd navigated without incident, having been through worse spatial impossibilities in Diagon Alley, looking for a compartment, when he heard a voice from behind a luggage trolley that sounded genuinely distressed. He was right here. "I had him in my pocket and now, oh, this is awful, Gran will be furious, she said I'd lose him, the speaker was a round-faced boy about Harry's age, currently crouched under a luggage cart looking in increasingly desperate directions. He had an honest, worried face and the particular quality of someone who expected things to go wrong and was therefore neither surprised nor particularly equipped to deal with it when they did. Harry stopped. He let Kale do its quiet sweep. There, behind the second luggage cart, under a fold of discarded paper, something small and warm and faintly, very faintly, emitting the low ambient energy of a living creature that was also, he was fairly sure, a toad. He walked over, crouched down, and retrieved the toad from behind the cart. It was small and brown and looked deeply unimpressed by its adventure. "Is this yours?" he said, turning back to the boy. The boy stared at the toad and then at Harry with the expression of someone who'd expected the universe to keep being difficult and had been surprised. "How did you? I looked there." He was behind the cart. Under some paper. Harry handed the toad over. "What's his name?" "Trevor." The boy took the toad with both hands, clutching it perhaps more firmly than Trevor entirely preferred. "I'm Neville. Neville Longbottom. Harry Potter." Neville blinked. Looked at Harry's forehead. Looked at Harry's face. Did a thing with his expression that was somewhere between nervousness and a genuine attempt to be normal about it. "I knew your parents," he said, and then immediately looked like he wished he'd said something else. "I mean, my parents knew them. They were, friends, I think. Orers." Harry looked at Neville properly. The ELD rune was quiescent, it didn't activate on its own, required intent and mutual connection, but he didn't need it to feel something in this encounter that had the quality of significance. Something was here in this person, under the awkwardness and the toad-related anxiety. Something solid. "Come on, then," Harry said. "Find a compartment with me." Neville blinked again. "Really? Unless you'd rather stand on the platform." "No, yes. I mean yes, compartment. Thank you." Neville tucked Trevor more securely into his pocket and grabbed his trunk with his free hand. They found a compartment halfway down the train that was mostly empty, loaded their trunks, and settled across from each other. Harry put his bag between his feet where he could feel the diary against his ankle. "You're not going to ask me about the scar?" Harry said. Neville thought about this. "I figured if you wanted to talk about it you would." Harry looked at him for a moment. "I like you," he said, which was not something he said often or casually. Neville turned slightly pink and looked at Trevor the toad. "Luna Lovegood found them." Harry felt her before he saw her, felt ELD flicker, not activate, but notice, in a way it hadn't with anyone else. Her magical signature was the strangest he'd encountered, layered and slightly sideways, like music played in an unusual key. It was entirely coherent, entirely itself, and absolutely unlike the standard signatures he'd been mapping since he got on the platform. The compartment door opened and a girl with long dirty blonde hair and very large, very clear gray eyes looked in at them with an expression of complete serenity. "Most compartments have at least one anxious person in them," she said, by way of explanation. "This one doesn't. I find it calming. May I sit here?" "Yes," Harry said. "Thank you." She came in, settled by the window, and placed a magazine on her lap that was upside down. She didn't flip it over. She looked out at the platform. Neville was watching her with the expression of someone who decided to withhold judgment and was finding this easier than expected. "I'm Luna," she said, to the window. "Harry." "Neville." "I know." She turned those clear eyes on Harry. "Not the scar." His eyes. "Your mother wrote a paper on blood rune harmonics when she was in her 6th year. It was rejected by the Journal of Applied Magical Theory because the editor was Boris Finkley and he didn't like the idea that magic could be personal. He thought that was mysticism. He was wrong." The compartment went quite still. "How do you know about my mother's paper?" Harry said carefully. "My father kept a copy. He thought she was onto something significant." Luna tilted her head. Are you? Am I what? Onto something significant. Harry looked at her for a long moment. The ELD rune hummed, quiet and interested. Yes, he said. Good, Luna said, and went back to her upside-down magazine as if the matter was settled. Neville caught Harry's eye across the compartment with an expression that said he wasn't entirely sure what had just happened but was prepared to accept it. Harry almost smiled. Draco Malfoy appeared 20 minutes outside of London. Harry had read about the Malfoy family in Lily's political notes. She'd written about Lucius Malfoy with a particular economy of prose, not contempt exactly, more the kind of wariness you applied to something you understood thoroughly and respected in the specific way you respected a structural fault in a building. You accounted for it, you didn't underestimate it, and you kept your distance when possible. The Malfoys are intelligent, wealthy, and politically connected, she'd written. They are also deeply invested in a worldview that requires a hierarchy to have meaning. Lucius needs to believe that blood determines value. He needs it more than he needs money or power, because without it he'd have to grapple with the question of what he actually is. The boy who opened the compartment door and looked in had his father's face but was, Harry thought, not quite his father's version of himself yet. That was still in progress. So it's true, Malfoy said. He was looking at Harry the way Harry had noticed several people on the platform looking at him, the way you look at a famous painting when you first see it in person, checking it against an expectation. Harry Potter. Yes, Harry said. I'm Draco Malfoy. He said it as if this should produce a specific reaction. I know the name, Harry said. The expression on Draco's face shifted very slightly, pleased that he was recognized, and then recalibrating as he worked out that knowing a name was not the same as being impressed by it. You'll want to be careful about who you befriend, Draco said, with a precision that he'd clearly been taught. His eyes went to Neville with a faint dismissal, then to Luna with something between confusion and disdain. Some families are more, Draco, Harry said. Draco stopped. I've met a lot of people today, Harry said pleasantly. The ones I've decided to spend time with are the ones I found interesting. You can decide whether you'd like to be interesting. He paused. Or you can give me the speech about bloodlines and social connections. Your choice. The two large boys who'd been flanking Draco in the corridor, Crabbe and Goyle, presumably, Lily's notes had mentioned them in the context of their fathers, looked between Harry and Draco with the blank attentiveness of people whose primary function was to exist behind their employer. Draco's jaw was doing something controlled. He was, Harry could see, trying to determine the correct response to something he hadn't been given a script for. I'll see you at school, then, Draco said, and his voice was level. Looking forward to it, Harry said, which was sincere. Draco withdrew. The compartment door closed. Neville exhaled. That was, fine, Harry said. He looked like he wanted to say something much worse. He did. He decided not to. Harry looked at the door. He's going to think about this conversation for a while. That's interesting enough. Luna turned a page of her magazine. Upside down. The feast was extraordinary in a sensory way that Harry had been partially prepared for. Lily had described the great hall in vivid terms, but that was still something else entirely to experience. The ceiling was the evening sky, deeply real in a way that made the top of the hall feel infinite. The candles were everywhere. The tables were full of children doing the cautious calculus of people who knew they were being sorted into identities they'd carry for 7 years. Harry watched. The Kale rune mapped the room's magical architecture with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The enchantments here were old and dense and interlocking, layers upon layers built up over centuries. It was beautiful in the way that old complex systems are beautiful, not clean, but coherent. He sat with Neville and Luna on a bench apart from the growing clusters, and watched the sorting begin. It went alphabetically, which put Harry well down the list. He watched each student approach the stool, each moment of hesitation or eagerness, the hat's pauses and pronouncements. He watched the tables receive their new members, the sheer volumes were informative about popularity dynamics he was already beginning to map. Granger, Hermione went to Gryffindor after only a moment's pause, and sat down with a precision that suggested she'd done a risk analysis on seating locations on the way across the hall. Longbottom, Neville took a bit longer. Harry watched Neville's face during the hat's consideration, the way it moved through anxiety toward something quieter and more decided. When it called Gryffindor, Neville looked surprised and then, a beat later, quietly pleased. Harry caught his eye across the hall and nodded. Neville straightened his spine. Love good. Luna stood at the stool for a moment and then the hat called Ravenclaw with an energy that suggested it had found something genuinely unusual in there, which matched Harry's own assessment precisely. Luna sat at the Ravenclaw table with the same composed serenity she'd brought to everything else. When his name was called, the hall went through a wave of reaction that he'd been expecting, the murmurs, the heads turning, the particular quality of attention that his name consistently generated. He walked to the stool and sat down and the hat came over his eyes. The hat's voice was like thinking but louder. Well, it said, and there was something in it that was, impressed. Startled. This is new. Hello, Harry said in his head. You're already doing it, the hat said. Mental architecture. Most students don't think at me, they just exist. Nervelessly. You're treating this like a conversation. Isn't it one? A pause. Yes. It is. Another pause. You're extraordinary, you know. I haven't seen a foundation like this since, well. Since your mother, actually. Though this is different. This is further. She taught me, Harry said. She left you the tools. You built the rest. The hat seemed to turn over something weighty. Where shall I put you? You do beautifully in Ravenclaw, the intelligence is genuinely exceptional. Slytherin would work with that ambition you're not quite admitting to. Hufflepuff for the loyalty, and there is loyalty here, deep loyalty, Gryffindor, Harry said. On what grounds? My mother. My father. And because Neville's there. The hat was quiet for a moment. You'd give up a more strategically optimal house for a friend you met 4 hours ago? He's not just a friend I met 4 hours ago. He's a Frank and Alice Longbottom's son who grew up knowing what he'd lost and became decent anyway. That's worth more than optimal. Another pause. And then, with something that felt very much like satisfaction, Gryffindor. The table erupted. Harry walked to it and sat next to Neville, who grinned at him with the unguarded warmth of someone who genuinely hoped and hadn't quite believed. How'd you know I'd be here? Neville said. Educated guess, Harry said. The teachers were a study in contrasts that Lily had described accurately enough that meeting them felt like recognizing people from second-hand accounts. Professor McGonagall was exactly as the diary had suggested, precise, principled, with a fundamental fairness underneath the strictness that Harry respected immediately. She watched her new students with the assessment of someone who'd seen enough first years to have patterns but was still looking for exceptions. Professor Flitwick was warm and technically excellent and visibly delighted when students engaged with the why of magic rather than just the how. Professor Quirrell was wrong. Harry had noticed it at the start of term feast, when the man had risen to leave the staff table early and passed close enough that Cale had given a sharp unpleasant ping. The wrongness was in the signature, not Quirrell's own, which was present but shallow and frightened, but something else layered underneath it, something old and thin and furious that was wrapped around Quirrell's energy like smoke around a lamp. He'd filed it under significant and requiring monitoring and watched Quirrell through dinner with the calm attention he usually reserved for things that were dangerous. Snape was something else entirely. The man's first potions lesson was a performance, clearly practiced, clearly intentional, designed to establish specific dynamics, and Harry watched it the way he watched all performances, for what was underneath them. When Snape asked his rapid-fire questions of Harry, trying to wrong-foot him, clearly, trying to establish the narrative of famous Potter knowing nothing, Harry had answered each one calmly and completely, and the expression on Snape's face had done something complicated. Aconite is also called wolfsbane or monkshood, Harry said. You use it in Draught of Living Death and wolfsbane potion. The potency depends on the phase of the moon during harvest if you're working with it for lycanthropic applications. Snape's eyes had narrowed. Where did you read that? My mother's notes. A pause that lasted 2 full seconds, which was long enough to feel like something. Take your seat, Potter, Snape said, and his voice was flat and impenetrable. Harry took his seat. He didn't look back, but he felt Snape's gaze between his shoulders for the rest of the lesson, not hostile exactly, but something that hadn't decided what it was yet. He and Neville were partnered, which turned out to be excellent. Neville, left to himself, was tentative and second-guessed every move. Neville with Harry calmly narrating the logic of each step, not the instructions, the logic, the why, moved with increasing confidence and produced a potion at the end of the period that Snape looked at for a moment and then said, in the tones of someone giving a compliment with his teeth clenched, was adequate. That's really good, Neville muttered, packing up. He told Marcus Flint his was barely functional last week. Adequate means he couldn't find anything wrong with it, Harry said. Neville looked at his cauldron. Ha! It was the second week when Harry did the thing that changed the social architecture of Gryffindor entirely. It happened at breakfast. Draco Malfoy came in late with Crabbe and Goyle, past the Gryffindor table, and said something to Neville about his remembrall, something that was technically a question but operationally a small piece of cruelty, designed to remind Neville of his reputation for forgetting things, delivered in front of enough people to ensure maximum effect. Neville looked at his plate. Harry put down his toast. Draco, he said. Malfoy stopped. What you just said to Neville was designed to make him feel stupid in public. It worked, a bit, you can see it in his shoulders. I want you to think about whether that was worth whatever you got out of it. He kept his voice conversational, unhurried. Not as an accusation. As a genuine question. Was it worth it? The Great Hall, in the immediate vicinity, had gone quiet. Draco's face was doing its careful thing, the controlled adjustment, checking for the angle of attack, trying to read what response would serve him. Mind your own business, Potter. Neville is my own business, Harry said simply. He turned back to his breakfast. The conversation was over in his estimation, which meant it was over. Draco stood there for a moment with no easy next move, and then left. Neville was staring at his pumpkin juice. You didn't have to do that. I know. Harry ate his toast. He's going to make things difficult for us. Probably. Harry considered. But he'll do it differently now. More carefully. He doesn't like not knowing how I'll respond. He paused. That's useful. Ron Weasley, 3 seats down, said, bloody hell, in a tone of genuine admiration. Percy Weasley, further down, said, language, Ron, in a tone of genuine pain fraternity. And Hermione Granger, who Harry had been watching because she watched everything, looked up from her book across the table with an expression that was, not friendly exactly, not yet. More like someone who'd been trying to solve a puzzle and had just been handed a piece they hadn't expected. Harry met her eyes for a moment. She looked back at her book. He thought, that one's going to take more time. That's fine. The rune work happened in the 3rd week, on a Tuesday evening, in a disused classroom on the 3rd floor that Harry had found during one of his systematic explorations of the castle. He'd chosen this room for 2 reasons. It was genuinely unused, the magical residue in the floor was old and undisturbed, no recent traffic, and it was far enough from both the library and the common rooms that accidental discovery was low. He'd left Knave running on the doorframe in redirect mode, not a lock, just a suggestion to passing minds that there was nothing here worth looking at. Neville had come because Harry asked him to. Luna had come because she'd appeared in the corridor outside the room before Harry arrived, which was something Harry had decided to simply accept as being part of how Luna operated. I want to explain something to both of you, Harry said, when they were settled. And then I want to ask something. And the asking is completely optional, I mean that, there's no social pressure attached to it. You can say no and it doesn't affect anything. Neville was watching him with that solid, patient attention. Luna was cross-legged on the floor with her shoes off, apparently content. Harry explained Blood Rune Craft. Not everything, not the 9-year education, not all of Lily's theoretical framework. But the core of it, what the system was, how it worked, what the runes did. He showed them his forearm and the small neat marks there. He let Kale open fully for the first time with someone present, and he said, "Watch this," and showed them how the room's magic looked to him, the old enchantments in the walls, the residual energy of previous students, the specific warm signatures that were Neville and Luna in the room with him. Neville's expression during this was the expression of someone whose concept of what was possible was updating in real time. Luna's expression was the expression of someone who'd always known this was real and was glad to see it confirmed. The rune called ELD, Harry said, creates a connection between people who both carry it. It's voluntary, it requires consent and intent from both people. It means you can feel when the other person is in trouble. Not thoughts, not location necessarily, more like, a sense. An alarm. And it means your magical output becomes stronger when you're in proximity to each other. The signatures reinforce. He paused. My mother developed it because she wanted magic that connected people instead of dividing them. She didn't get to use it the way she planned. I want to. The room was quiet. What you're asking, Neville said slowly, is if we want to be part of that. Yes. What does it feel like? The inscription. It hurts a little. Like a sharp pinch. And then there's a warmth that comes in behind it. Harry held his arm out, turned inward so they could see ELD's mark. It takes about 10 minutes. Neville looked at it. Then he held out his own arm. All right. Luna was already offering her wrist, with the serenity of someone agreeing to something they decided 3 weeks ago. Harry worked carefully and precisely, with Neville first and then Luna, the same deliberate strokes he'd used on himself. Neville winced once and then was still, and when the warmth came he made a small sound and his eyes went wide. Oh, Neville said. Oh, yes, Harry said. I can feel you, Neville said, sounding wondering. Both of you. It's like music you can feel instead of hear. That's exactly what it is, Luna said, looking at the mark on her inner wrist with a small smile. Hello, both of you. Harry felt them both, Neville's solid warmth, like an old stone wall that turns out to be warm from the sun, and Luna's sideways brightness, like a frequency that runs slightly above the standard range. He felt them the way he'd felt the first rune click into place at age 6, something that had been absent and was now simply, entirely, here. He thought, Mom. I'm doing it. He thought, I'm building what you started. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, in his careful handwriting, the Codex Circle. Founding members, H. J. Potter. N. F. Longbottom. L. Lovegood. He stared at the words for a moment. Then he started writing. Chapter 3, Platform 9 3/4. The castle had a rhythm to it that Harry had mapped by the 4th week. Not the class schedule, that was fixed and simple and he'd memorized it in the first 3 days. The deeper rhythm. The way the staircases moved most frequently between 7 and 8 in the morning when students were rushing to breakfast. The specific corridor on the 2nd floor where the drafts came from and why, a gap in the enchantment work over the eastern window, old and probably never fixed because it would require relaying a section of the foundational ward structure that nobody had touched since 1842, according to a maintenance plaque he'd found behind a tapestry. The fact that Peeves the poltergeist had a circuit he repeated every 48 hours with only minor variations, and avoided the 4th floor entirely, and Harry had spent a productive evening working out that there was something in the 4th floor east corridor that Peeves didn't like, which was interesting. He'd been mapping the castle's magical architecture the way he'd mapped the Dursley's house, with the same patient, systematic attention to detail that most people reserved for things they found interesting, and he applied to everything. Because everything was interesting, in the end. Everything had structure. Structure had logic. Logic had implications. The implications were what mattered. The third floor was the most interesting floor. Not the unused classroom he'd claimed, though that was useful. The corridor. The one with the locked door at the end. He'd found it on his second full exploration of the castle, on a Wednesday evening when Neville was in the common room doing herbology homework and Luna had gone to the Ravenclaw Tower to do something she'd described as listening to the castle breathe, which Harry had taken as a lunar description of something probably equivalent to his own diagnostic practices. He'd stood in front of the door and let Kale run at full depth. What came back had made him stand very still for a long time. The door was multi-warded, 7 distinct enchantments layered in sequence, each one keyed differently, which meant 7 different casters or 7 different casting methods. The signatures were varied. He could feel McGonagall's in there, crisp and precise, Flitwick's, warm and technically intricate, one that was old and deep and institutional, probably Dumbledore's, and several others he didn't recognize yet but was cataloguing. Behind the wards, something lived. Not a person, an animal, large, multiple sources of heat and breath. And beyond the animal, beyond it, something else. Something that the wards were actually about. Something he couldn't see clearly but that had a resonance he'd felt faintly before, in Lily's vault at Gringotts, hovering around those sealed boxes. He'd stood there for 10 minutes, building a picture. Then he'd walked away, gone back to the common room, and written in his notebook, 3rd floor corridor. Multi-ward, 7 layers. Animal, 3-headed, from the heat pattern, or possibly 3 animals in close proximity. Beyond that, an object of significant magical density. Small. High concentration. Protected for good reason. He'd added, below that, Quirrell's signature was in there. Faint. Exploratory. He's looked at the wards. He hasn't broken them yet. He'd underlined that last line and gone to bed. The flying lesson happened on a Thursday, and Harry had been looking forward to it with the specific quality of anticipation he applied to things that were entirely new. He had no framework for broomstick flying. Lily's diary was comprehensive about many things, but she'd been a charm specialist and a runic scholar and her physical engagement with magic had been precision-based rather than kinetic. There were no flying notes. He was, for once, going into something fresh. It turned out he was, apparently, a natural. He realized this about 4 seconds after kicking off from the ground, the way the broom responded to intent rather than just direction, the way the balance point was biological and mathematical at once, the way the Ain rune's stability function translated almost immediately into an instinctive physical steadiness at altitude. He rose to about 20 feet, held there, and took stock. The castle looked extraordinary from above. The ground spread out in a geometry he hadn't been able to appreciate from inside it, the subtle defensive logic of the building's layout, the way the wards wrapped it at altitude and created something he could feel even here as a kind of warm pressure, like being held. "Mr. Potter," Madam Hooch said, from below, with the voice of someone who'd seen a lot of new flyers and was watching one who didn't need correcting. "Perhaps a little lower to start." "Of course," Harry said, and came down to 10 feet, which was lower than he'd been. Neville, on the ground, was having a different experience. His broom was twitching under his hand while he argued with it in a low, desperate voice, and when he finally committed to it and it shot upward, his face had the expression of someone who'd made a decision they were immediately reconsidering. The remembrall sailed out of Neville's pocket somewhere near 15 feet. Harry watched it arc. He watched Neville's trajectory, the broom wobbling, Neville's hands doing the wrong things, the ground coming. Harry was already moving. He caught the remembrall at the same moment Neville's broom dropped into a recovery arc 3 feet from the ground, not a controlled arc, a lucky one, but it held. Neville ended up more or less upright, vibrating, 6 inches above the grass. Harry landed beside him and held out the remembrall. "Thanks," Neville managed, about 4 beats later. "The problem was your right hand," Harry said, keeping his voice low and not drawing more attention than necessary. "You were holding too tight. The broom reads tension as a command, it thought you wanted to accelerate. Let your grip loosen on the back hand, keep it firm on the front. Neville took a breath. Looked at his hands. Looked at the broom. Tried again. He didn't fly brilliantly. But he didn't fall. Madame Hooch watched Harry during the rest of the lesson with an expression that was professionally careful but kept slipping toward the face of someone composing an internal message to the Quidditch captain. Draco Malfoy had watched the whole thing, the catch, the recovery, Neville not falling, with an expression Harry couldn't read from across the pitch. Not jealousy exactly. Something more complex, something that was recalibrating. Harry had been watching Draco recalibrate every time they interacted, and he was beginning to form a theory. Draco was rebuilding his model of what Harry was, and the new model was confusing him because it didn't fit any of his prior categories. "Nice flying," Draco said, as they were walking in from the pitch. Not snide. Almost, genuine. "Thanks," Harry said. "Where did you learn?" "First time," Harry said. Draco stopped walking. Harry kept going. The incident with the letter happened on a Saturday, and it was the thing that made the Quidditch angle unavoidable. Harry had been in the third-floor classroom with Neville and Luna, working on Neville's foundational understanding of runic logic, not the inscriptions yet, just the theory, the framework, so that if Neville eventually decided he wanted to carry ELD he'd understand what he was agreeing to and not be working from faith alone. Luna was reading while occasionally saying things that were both tangential and precise, in the way she always did. A school owl had found him there. The ward should have deterred it. Theoretically, the redirect suggestion he'd placed on the door was meant to divert passing attention, but owls worked on a system the wards weren't calibrated for. He'd make a note to adjust. The letter was from McGonagall. Brief, specific, and unexpected. "Mr. Potter, please come to the trophy room at your earliest convenience. Bring your broomstick." Professor McGonagall. He didn't own a broomstick. He arrived at the trophy room regardless, and found McGonagall there with a long, slim package under her arm and an expression that was the professional equivalent of very pleased but not showing it. "I don't have a broomstick," Harry said. "You will in a moment." She held out the package. "This is a Nimbus 2000. The fastest production broom currently available. I'm told you've never flown before Thursday." "First time," Harry confirmed. "Oliver Wood is our Quidditch captain. He watched your flying lesson. He would like you to consider Seeker." She paused. "I am making this offer because I believe you have genuine talent, not because of any fame or, I understand," Harry said. "Thank you." She almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd used when he'd answered a transfiguration question about the theory behind the switching spell that had been slightly more comprehensive than she'd prepared for. "You'd be the youngest Seeker in a century. That's a meaningful statistic if what I care about is the record," Harry said. "I care about it because flying is excellent." McGonagall did actually smile then, briefly, before putting it away. "Training Tuesdays and Thursdays. Try not to tell the whole school before the match." Draco Malfoy apparently purchased the entire Slytherin team new Nimbus 2001s last week, which is the sort of news that tends to make people competitive in unhelpful ways. Harry thought about Draco recalibrating. What's faster, the 2000 or the 2001? In a straight race, the 2001. In a technical environment, the difference is negligible and mostly comes down to the rider. "Good," Harry said. He took the broomstick home to the common room and stood it against his bedpost, and Neville looked at it for a moment and then at Harry and said, "Seeker," with an expression of someone piecing together data points. "Yes," Harry said. "Against Malfoy?" "Eventually." Neville looked at the broom again. "I want to watch that match very much," he said. Hermione came to him the night before the Halloween feast, and Harry had been expecting her for weeks. She came to the third-floor classroom, which told him she'd been paying attention to his movements, a level of systematic observation that he genuinely respected. She knocked on the door, which was more than most people would have done, since the redirect suggestion was still in place and the knock meant she'd pushed through it on pure determination. He opened the door. She was carrying 3 books, which appeared to be her version of emotional armor. "You're not tutoring Neville," she said. "Or, you are, but it's not standard tutoring. I've been watching the change in his work. It's too fundamental. His theoretical understanding is restructuring, not just improving. Something changed in how he's framing magical concepts, and it happened over a very specific time period." "Correct," Harry said. She blinked. She'd prepared for deflection, apparently. "You're teaching him something." "Yes." "What?" He looked at her for a moment. Not assessing her magical signature, he'd had that mapped for weeks, but looking at her, at the precision of the question and the quality of the courage it had taken to come and ask it directly. Because it had taken courage, he could see that. She wasn't comfortable approaching him. She'd done it anyway. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat down with her books in her lap and looked around the room, noting the notebooks on the floor, the diagrams he'd pinned to one wall, the small array of objects in the corner that he'd been using for Kale mapping practice. Her eyes moved quickly and catalogued well. "My mother was a blood rune scholar," Harry said. "She developed a magical system. I've been learning it since I was 6. I've been teaching Neville some of the theory because he's in the circle." "The circle," she repeated. "A connection system. Based on linked rune inscriptions." He held out his forearm and let her look. "It's not standard magic. It doesn't map cleanly onto anything Hogwarts teaches. The theoretical foundations are partly in the literature if you know where to look. My mother published a paper in her 6th year that got rejected, but some copies survived." Hermione was looking at the rune marks with the expression of someone whose brain was going very fast. "Is it safe?" "The inscriptions are permanent, which is not the same as unsafe. The connection is permanent too, once established." He paused. "Before you ask, no, it's not mind control, it's not binding, it doesn't override your autonomy in any way. It's a resonance link. You'd feel when the other members of the circle are in serious danger. You'd have a slight amplification effect when you're working magic in their proximity." She looked up from his arm. "Can I read your mother's paper? If you can find the copies my father kept in the secondary Potter vault, and if I decided to retrieve them, yes." He paused. "Or you could trust me." She made a face that was not quite hostile and not quite amused. "I don't know you well enough to trust you." "That's fair," he said. "I've been watching you for weeks, though. I know a bit more about you than you know about me." He said it without any edge. "Informational. You're the best pure student in our year. You've already moved past what's being taught in 3 of our classes. You're frustrated by the pace. You study alone because you think asking questions marks you as insufficiently prepared, but actually it's because other students find your intelligence uncomfortable and you've stopped trying to reach them." The room was quiet. Hermione's jaw was doing something careful. "You've been watching me. I watch everyone. It's not threatening, it's what I do." He closed his notebook. "I'm telling you because you're smart enough to have figured out most of it yourself, and I don't want to waste both our time pretending I know less about you than I do." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, why are you telling me about all this? The circle, the runes." "Because you came here. Because you pushed through the ward on the door, which takes genuine conviction. Because Neville's doing better and you noticed and investigated instead of ignoring it." He shrugged slightly. "The circle isn't about numbers. I'm not collecting people. I'm asking the people who are worth asking." "You're saying I'm worth asking." "I'm saying you could be, if you want to be." He paused. "Read what you can find on Blood Rune Harmonics. Come back when you have questions." "You'll have questions." She stood up, holding her books, and he could see her turning it all over, the instinct for caution versus the hunger for something that was clearly academically extraordinary. The tension between following the rules and following the interesting thing. "The paper," she said. "Lily Potter's 6th year paper. What was it called?" Toward a unified theory of magical signature and living runic application. He'd memorized the title when he was 7. Journal of Applied Magical Theory, Autumn 1976 submission. Rejected by Boris Finkley on grounds of insufficient empirical support, which is interesting because she'd included 17 pages of experimental data. Hermione wrote this down. Of course she did. She wrote it down the way Harry wrote things, fast, certain, filing it immediately in the system in her head. She left without saying whether she'd come back. She came back the next evening with 4 more books, 3 of which Harry hadn't read, and a look on her face that meant she'd been up until 2 in the morning reading and had questions. He'd been right about that part. The Halloween feast was the most important thing on Harry's calendar, not because of the feast itself but because of what the feast would make possible. He'd been watching Quirrell. He'd been watching him carefully and systematically for 5 weeks now, tracking the man's movements with the same patience he'd applied to Vernon's footstep pattern, mapping the Kale picture of that doubled signature, shallow frightened Quirrell on the outside, and beneath it the old furious thing that Harry had no confirmed name for but strongly suspected. He'd also been reading. Specifically, he'd been reading in the library's restricted section, which he'd gained access to via the simple method of asking Professor Flitwick for a signed note, explaining that he was interested in advanced magical theory and had outpaced the standard texts, and watching Flitwick produce the note with the enthusiasm of a teacher who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of request. The restricted section wasn't entirely about dark magic, much of it was simply advanced or unstable theory that wasn't appropriate for standard coursework. Lily's work, In a Better World, might have ended up there. He'd found what he was looking for on a Wednesday in a book called Ombra e Sostanza, The Theory and Practice of Parasitic Magical Attachment, published in 1831 by an Italian scholar named Elisabetta Verano. The book was in English translation, dense, and not pleasant reading, but it was specific. A powerful enough magical will, separated from its body through a failed destructive ritual, could theoretically subsist by parasitic attachment to a living host, feeding on the host's magical energy while suppressing the host's own will. Harry had read that passage sitting cross-legged on the library floor, with the book open in his lap, and let the picture assemble. A failed killing curse. A fragment of something that should have been destroyed. 10 years of finding somewhere to hide. A defense against the dark arts professor who'd applied every year for 10 years running, according to a footnote in Hogwarts, a history that he'd found because he read everything, and had always been refused. What was behind that third-floor door? What Quirrell was looking for? He'd written it all out in his notebook when he got back to the common room, in careful, precise sequence, and looked at the complete picture for a long time. Then he'd written, Verano's solution, parasitic attachment can be disrupted through direct application of the host's own signature, focused to exclusion of the parasite. The host's magic doesn't recognize the parasite as self. Given the right catalyst, physical contact, high-intensity signature output, the parasite should experience the host's magic as rejection. Effectively, the parasite is immune to standard spells but not to the host's own directed essence. He'd underlined the last sentence. Then he'd gone to find Luna. She'd been in her tower, predictably, and she'd listened to everything he said with her grey eyes clear and attentive, and when he was done she'd said, "So you've known what Quirrell is for 5 weeks?" "Yes." "And you've been waiting?" "I've been gathering information." "There's a difference." Luna tilted her head. "What are you waiting for now?" "For him to move," Harry said. "He's going to move at Halloween. The feast is the logical moment, the entire staff will be in the Great Hall, the student population is concentrated, the castle is in a disrupted state from the festivities. If he wants uninterrupted access to the 3rd floor, that's when. So you want him to move. I want to control when and where it happens." He paused. "I have something he can't account for. I want to use it at the right moment." Luna looked at him for a long moment. "You should tell Neville." "I'm going to." "And Hermione." Harry considered this. Hermione had been coming to the 3rd floor classroom every other evening for 3 weeks. She'd read everything he'd pointed her toward and argued with him about roughly 40% of it in the intelligent, rigorous way that made the arguments worth having. She'd looked at the rune inscriptions, asked 14 specific technical questions, and then gone silent for 2 days, and then come back and asked him to explain the ELD rune's mechanism in detail, very carefully, as if she was trying to find the flaw in it. She hadn't found one. She hadn't asked yet. But she was close to asking. "I'll tell her," Harry said. "What she does with it is up to her." The feast itself was extraordinary in exactly the way Harry had anticipated, immense, golden, fragrant, with approximately 300 young witches and wizards in various states of candy-induced happiness. He ate well, which he considered a practical act. He kept his attention split between his table mates and the staff table at the front. Quirrell left during the second course. Not dramatically, just a quiet scrape of a chair, a brief word to the teacher on his left, gone. Harry watched through his peripheral vision. He watched long enough to be sure of the direction. Then he turned to Neville. "He's gone," Harry said, quietly. "Heading for the 3rd floor." Neville, who'd been briefed 3 days ago and had spent those 3 days in a state of focused anxiety that had somehow sharpened rather than scattered his attention, looked up from his pumpkin juice. Now. Harry pushed back from the table. "We're leaving. Come on." He caught Hermione's eye across the table as he stood. She'd been watching him, she was always watching him, and something in his expression communicated enough, because she put her fork down and said, "Wait," in a voice low enough that only the immediate area heard. "Stay or come," he said. "Your choice. But decide now." She stood up. They crossed the Great Hall, which meant crossing under Dumbledore's gaze at the staff table. Harry looked at the headmaster for precisely 1 moment as they passed, long enough to make eye contact, not long enough to invite interception. Dumbledore's blue eyes held a particular quality of alertness, and Harry thought, "He knows I know something. He's deciding whether to stop me." He didn't stop them. They were in the corridor, 3 of them, Harry, Neville, Hermione, and the noise of the feast fell away behind them and the castle's deeper rhythm came up around them instead. Their footsteps on the stone. The faint warm pressure of the wards. "Will you tell me now what exactly the plan is?" Hermione said, keeping pace with his walk without breaking into a run, which Harry appreciated. "You didn't run towards something unless you needed to." "There's a parasitic magical consciousness attached to Quirrell," Harry said. "It wants what's behind the 3rd floor wards. If it gets there tonight, the consequences are significant." Hermione's stride didn't falter, but her breath did for 1 beat. "A parasitic consciousness. Meaning it needs a body because it doesn't have one. Meaning it's been using Quirrell's." Another brief silence. "That's Voldemort." Harry glanced at her. She'd said it without flinching, which told him something about the quality of her. "I believe so," Harry said. Lily's diary had notes on the night. The killing curse rebounded, she'd cast a sacrificial protection. But a fragment survived. It's been looking for ways back. He paused. "I've been expecting this for 5 weeks. And your plan is, to be there when it happens instead of letting it happen alone." "That's barely a plan," Hermione said. "There's more to it than that." "How much more?" "Enough." They reached the 3rd floor. The corridor was quiet and cold and the locked door at the end was open. Slightly, only an inch, but the wards had been touched. Harry could feel the disturbance in the layered signatures, like someone had peeled back the first few carefully. "He's through," Harry said. He pushed the door open. The 3-headed dog was not subtle as a guardian. It was the size of a small building and it was awake and all 3 of its heads oriented on them the instant the door opened, a sound coming from somewhere in its chest that was less like a growl and more like a geological event. Hermione made a sound. "Back," Harry said, to her and Neville, and stepped forward instead of backward. The Kale rune opened. He looked at the dog the way he looked at everything, for structure, for logic, for the how it works. 3 heads, 1 body. Enormous magical sensitivity in the nose rather than the eyes. The floor beneath it had a trapdoor, he could feel the seam in the enchantment work. And in the far corner, very faint, the lingering edge of a sleep charm that was still technically active. Someone had played music. Quirrell had played it to sleep, apparently. There was a small harp in the corner that had been moving and had now stopped. The dog was waking back up from the residual effect, groggy and furious. Harry found the thorn rune in his network, focus, precision, and fed a very specific, very narrow output into the sleep charm's residual frequency. Not his own casting exactly, more like reinforcing something that was already there. The rune network gave him an efficiency that standard casting wouldn't have, less bleed, less noise, more precision. The dog's 3 heads went through a sequence of decreasing aggression over about 30 seconds. Then one head lowered. Then another. Then the third, heavily, like a wall deciding to stop standing. The dog sat. Then lay down. Then was quiet. Neville exhaled very slowly. Hermione said nothing, which was its own kind of response. Harry went to the trapdoor and opened it. "You're going down there," Hermione said. "Yes. There are more traps. I read about the security design I didn't read about the security design specifically, but it's obvious there would be more traps." "Almost certainly." He looked at her. "You don't have to come." She looked at the trapdoor. Then she looked at him. There was something working in her face, the careful balance between the person she'd been trained to be, rule-following and systematic and cautious, and the person she actually was underneath that, the one who'd pushed through his ward and read restricted books by lamplight and asked questions until she understood. "I'm coming," she said. "I know," he said. He dropped through the trapdoor, and the dark came up around him, and behind him he heard Neville say, "All right then," in the quiet voice of someone who'd already decided, and then Hermione's sharp intake of breath as she followed, and then they were all three falling together through a cold darkness towards something that Harry had been walking toward for 5 weeks. He wasn't afraid. He was, in the specific way that was sometimes indistinguishable from fear but was not it, completely and entirely ready. The devil's snare came up fast, and its vines caught them, and Harry, without panic, said, "Light, Neville, like Flitwick showed you," because he'd seen in Neville's notebook that he'd been practicing lumos with an intensity that their assignments didn't require, and Neville's wand came up and the light was broader and steadier than first-year lumos had any right to be, and the vines recoiled, and they dropped through. The rune warmth on Harry's wrist was steady and sure. All 3 of them. Present. Connected. Moving forward. The room of keys was a cathedral of motion and blue light. Hundreds of winged keys circled overhead in a shifting, overlapping pattern that was genuinely beautiful and also specifically designed to be confusing, similar shapes, constant motion, the eye unable to track any single one. There were 3 brooms against the wall. The door at the far end had a single large keyhole, and the key that fit it was, presumably, somewhere in that spiraling mass above them. Harry was already on a broom before Hermione finished taking in the room. Kale opened fully. He mapped the key signatures above him, not magical signatures, physical ones, the slight asymmetry of any physical object that had been used, the faint bending of the light that meant a wing that had been caught and struggled. He was looking for the one that was slightly damaged because it had been caught before. Quirrell had been through here, which meant one key had been used and would be, there. A large silver key, 4th ring from the outside, with a bent left wing, currently moving with the studied regularity of something trying not to be noticed. He went after it at an angle, cutting across the flight path rather than chasing it directly, calculating where it would have to be based on where it was and how fast the ring was moving. Hermione said something from below that he didn't fully hear. Neville cheered. He closed his hand around the key's body, mid-flight, and felt it go still. He was back on the ground in 4 seconds. He unlocked the door. They went through. The chessboard was enormous and cold and the pieces were already set in a mid-game position that Harry recognized. Someone had played here already, Quirrell again, and the position showed he'd sacrificed 2 pieces to move through fast. The game was still active. The remaining white pieces waited, and the black pieces stood in the new configuration, and the path through the board was closed. "I can play," Harry said. Hermione had been studying the board with the intensity of someone who'd spent years playing chess competitively. The position Quirrell left, he was white, going through from the black end. He moved fast, which means he left weaknesses. Her eyes moved rapidly. "If we're white, we need to get to the other end, we need to clear a path without losing anyone," Harry said. "Not just the game, the pieces. They'll attack each other." "I know." She pointed. "Knight to e5. Then bishop takes, no. Bishop to c4 first, then knight. That opens a column." She paused. "This costs the knight eventually. The piece or one of us?" She looked at him steadily. "I'll be the knight." "No," Neville said, from beside them, with a quiet firmness that stopped both of them. "I will." He was looking at the board with an expression that was not quite calm but was close to it, the expression of someone who decided. "I'm not brilliant at chess. But I know what a sacrifice position looks like. And I know how to sit still and wait for it." Harry looked at him. The ELD warmth on his wrist was steady, Neville's specific note in it, like the sound of something that won't move. "3 moves," Harry said. "Then we get you out." "4," Neville said. "Let me do it properly." They played. Hermione called the moves with fast, decisive logic. Harry watched the board and the pieces and the mathematics of position and force, and when Neville rode the white knight forward into the sequence that Hermione had designed, and when the black queen swung its piece at Neville's square with the terrible efficiency of the game, Harry was already tracking the impact and calling the spell to cushion it before it landed. Neville hit the stone floor and lay still for a moment. Harry reached him in 4 steps. The rune warmth was present, shaken, rattled, but present. "I'm all right," Neville said, from the floor, with the slightly strained voice of someone who'd been hit very hard and was cataloging damage. "I'm all right. The path's open." Harry looked at the board. The path was open. He looked at Hermione. "You get Neville out," he said. "Get him back upstairs. Get a teacher, McGonagall if you can, Dumbledore if you can find him faster." Hermione looked at the door at the far end. Then at him. "You're going alone. You're going for help. That's more useful." "Harry, Hermione." He said her name like it meant something, because it did. "I know what I'm doing. And I know what I have that Quirrell doesn't." He held up his wrist where ELD's mark was warm. "You and Neville aren't backup. You are the plan. The plan has 3 parts and you're 2 of them. Go." She looked at him for one more moment. Something in her expression was the face of someone making a decision they won't be able to unmake. "Come back," she said. "Obviously," Harry said, and walked through the door. The final chamber was dark except for a row of purple flames along one wall and the figure standing before a large ornate mirror, speaking quietly to the glass. Harry stopped just inside the door. He let Cale open all the way. The thing in Quirrell's face was aware of him. He could feel it reorient, the way a predator reorients when something enters the room. "Harry Potter," said the back of Quirrell's head, and then Quirrell turned around. The man's face was waxy and frightened in the way of someone who'd been frightened for a very long time. But the voice that came from around the back of his head, when the turban unwound, was the other thing, thin, cold, patient. "Interesting," said the face at the back of Quirrell's head. "Quite interesting. A child walks in alone." Harry looked at the mirror. He could feel what was inside it, the dense concentration of whatever object the wards were protecting, and could feel that it hadn't transferred yet. Quirrell hadn't gotten it. "You've been watching me," the thin voice said. "I can feel it. You have an unusual magical signature. Very precisely organized." A pause. "Your mother's work." "Yes," Harry said. She was talented. It was a pity. Harry looked at the face in the back of Quirrell's head and felt nothing that resembled the fear it was probably expecting. He felt the clean bright heat of his own magic running through the rune network, the whole architecture of it, 9 runes and their geometric structure, the diamond lattice pattern he'd worked out at age 9 in Petunia's garden, and ELD at the center of it, warm and present, carrying Neville and Hermione like lit windows across a dark city. "Tell me," he said, "how long have you been surviving like this? Attaching to people, feeding on what isn't yours?" "Since your mother destroyed my body," the voice said, and it was cold with a specific quality that had survived a decade of being nearly nothing. "She was cleverer than I expected. You're here to try to finish what she started." "No," Harry said. "I'm here to finish what she started. There's a difference." He stepped forward. Chapter 4, The Architecture of Power. The thing wearing Quirrell's face had been alive for 1,000 years in one form or another, and it knew the shape of a threat. What it did not know, what it had never encountered, because it was genuinely new, was Harry Potter walking toward it with the calm of someone who'd been working toward this specific moment for 5 weeks and was simply, finally, here. "Finite incantatum," Quirrell said, "wand up," and the purple flames along the wall guttered and died, plunging the chamber into a darkness broken only by the mirror's faint luminescence and the glow of the rune network running at full depth under Harry's skin. Harry could feel it, the familiar warm architecture, the diamond lattice he'd built at 9 years old in Petunia's garden, running clean and steady. "You won't find the stone," Harry said. "Not tonight." "Won't I?" "Not a question." The voice from the back of Quirrell's head had the quality of something that had outlasted enough certainty to stop being impressed by it. "The mirror shows what you want, not what exists. You know this." Harry stopped 6 feet away from Quirrell. The Kale rune was mapping everything, the room's residual enchantments, the precise location of the object in the mirror, and most importantly, the structure of the parasitic attachment. Verano's description had been accurate. Quirrell's own signature was underneath the other presence like a man under a heavy stone, thin and frightened but distinct. Separate. Not consumed. Not yet. "You've read Verano," the thing said. "Among others." A pause that had texture to it, the texture of something reassessing. "You're 11 years old." "Yes," Harry said. "Explain yourself." "My mother left me her work. I extended it." He kept his voice level. "Informational. You've been attached to Quirrell for 9 months, approximately, based on when he started the position. You're draining him. His core signature is depleted to somewhere around 40% of baseline capacity, which is why his spell quality has been declining since October. You've been supplementing with ambient energy where you can find it, which is why the 4th floor west corridor has been feeling wrong all term." Quirrell's wand arm was very still. The face at the back of his head had an expression that was, Harry thought, closer to curiosity than anger. Which was interesting. "You came here knowing this," the voice said. "I came here to stop you getting the stone. Tonight. The method depends on you." "What method?" "I need you to touch me," Harry said. The chamber went very still. "That," said the voice, slowly, "is not the request I expected." "I know." Harry held his right hand out, palm up, relaxed. Verano was specific. A parasitic attachment of this kind experiences the host's own directed essence as rejection, because the parasite's signature and the host's signature are distinct. The parasite is immune to external spells. "You've absorbed enough magical knowledge in 1,000 years to deflect anything I could cast at you through a wand. But you haven't encountered Blood Rune Craft. You don't have a framework for it." He paused. "My mother destroyed your body with love, which you also didn't have a framework for. The mechanism is similar. Her signature, directed outward at full intensity, was incompatible with yours. Mine is the same. You're proposing to use yourself as a weapon." "I'm proposing to finish what she started," Harry said, and his voice was steady and certain and entirely without fear. "Those are different." Quirrell moved. Not toward Harry, sideways, wand up, and the spell he threw was wordless and fast and came with the signature of something that wasn't Quirrell casting but the other presence directing the man's hand. Harry's Knave rune fired on instinct, the redirect function he'd been practicing for 4 years, and the spell went sideways and cracked against the far wall leaving a scorch mark that smelled of something ancient and wrong. The thing had spell knowledge that was centuries deep. Harry knew this. He hadn't planned to survive it on speed or power, he'd planned to survive it on geometry. He moved, and the Ain anchor held his signature steady against the chaos of the chamber, and the Thorn rune concentrated his output to a single focused thread, and he ran the Knave redirect in a continuous loop rather than firing it once, a sustained deflection field rather than a single response. It cost more. He could feel it pulling at the reserves of his rune network, the diamond lattice working at capacity, distributing load. 2 more spells cracked against the Knave redirect. One grazed the edge of the field and he felt it, cold, sharp, a scrape across his left arm that burned and then faded as the Ain anchor compensated. Quirrell was closing the distance. The thing was maneuvering them together, Harry realized, not being lured into his trap, but constructing its own version of the same idea. It wanted physical contact too. It wanted to transfer. Harry let him come. You think you can manage it, the voice said, 3 feet away now, because you've read about it. You have the theory. But the practical reality of a magical consciousness attempting to transfer through you, I know what it will feel like, Harry said. Do you? Lily described it. In her notes, the night it happened. She wrote about what she felt when she understood what was in the room with her, what it wanted, what it was willing to do to a child. She wrote about the fear and then she wrote about what she did with it. His voice was perfectly steady. She chose. She chose you touching her instead of you touching me, even though you were already in the room for me. She put herself between us. The chamber was very quiet. I am, Harry said, going to do the same thing. Except I'm going to choose it knowing what you are. She only had 30 seconds to decide. Quirrell grabbed his wrist. The pain was immediate and total and of a kind that had no reference point in Harry's prior experience, which was not without its share of pain. It was the sensation of something fundamentally wrong, not wrong like injury, but wrong like a key that doesn't fit being forced into a lock. The parasitic consciousness met Harry's directed signature and recoiled, and the recoil was mutual, an impact that went through the rune network like a struck bell, the ELD warmth flaring hard and urgent, sending a pulse through the connection, not a call for help, just a here, a present, a you are not alone. He felt Neville and Hermione across the link like twin flames in his chest, distant but clear, and he held on to that and he opened the rune network all the way. All 9 runes. The full diamond lattice at maximum capacity. His own signature directed outward like a lens bringing sunlight to a point, his particular, personal, incompatible magic, the key that fit exactly one lock, himself, directed at the thing that was trying to force its way through him. Quirrell screamed. Not Harry. Quirrell. The man's hands on Harry's wrist were burning, Harry could see it, the skin blistering where contact was made, which was Verano's mechanism exactly, the host's body experiencing the rejection before the consciousness could fully realize what was happening. Quirrell tried to release him and couldn't immediately, because the network had locked the point of contact in a feedback loop, the parasite's attempt to transfer running directly into Harry's outward directed signature and bouncing. The parasite itself, the thin cold furious thing that had outlasted its body and 10 years of near-nothingness, was making a sound that Harry heard not through his ears but through the Kale rune, the magical sense that had no good analogy. It was the sound of something being refused. Of a door that had been promised open and finding it shut. The contact broke. Quirrell staggered back. His hands were badly damaged, skin gray and blistered, and the face at the back of his head was contorted with something that might have been pain and might have been fury and might have been the first edge of real fear. Harry stood. His arm hurt from the graze. His head was ringing from the feedback. The rune network was running hot, he could feel it the way you feel a muscle after serious exertion, the warmth of something that had been asked for a lot. But the lattice was holding. The diamond structure distributed the load. He'd been right about the geometry. He was still standing. Your mother's work, the voice said, and it was thinner now, less present. You extended it. Yes. You used yourself as the weapon and the shield simultaneously. Yes. A pause. The chamber seemed colder than it had been, or maybe that was the residue of the expelled power. I underestimated you. People do, Harry said. I've been working on that. He stepped forward again. Quirrell moved backward. The man's face was terrible, gray and sweating, the damage to his hands clearly severe, his own signature flickering and struggling like a candle in a wind. The parasite was weakened, its grip on the host loosened by what had happened, and Harry could see in the Kale reading that the double signature was coming apart at the seams, the two presences no longer overlapping cleanly. The stone, the voice said. No, Harry said. The stone will restore me, I know. Harry was 6 feet away. That's why you're not getting it tonight. He looked at the mirror. He let Kale do the work Lily had described in a theoretical note on page 93 of her diary, which he'd spent a week trying to work out the mechanism for before it clicked. The mirror showed desire, but desire was a form of magical signature, and signature was readable. He looked at the mirror with Kale open and he understood what the stone was and where it was, and he reached into the mirror's enchantment with the precision of Thorn and the stable grounding of Ain, and he pulled. The stone dropped into his palm from the mirror's surface like a key falling from a lock. He closed his fingers around it. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees all at once. The thing in Quirrell's head went completely silent, and the silence was of a quality that was almost a sound, the sound of something that had just understood that the situation had changed irrevocably. I'm not going to destroy it, Harry said. He kept his voice even, because evenness was not coldness and not cruelty, it was just clarity. Not tonight. I don't know enough about it yet. But you don't get it, and Quirrell needs a hospital, and I need to have a conversation with Dumbledore that is long overdue. He turned toward the door. You cannot simply walk away, the voice said, and for the first time there was something in it that was not authority or cold intelligence but something more exposed. You are a child. You do not simply walk away from, watch me, Harry said, and kept walking. He heard the chamber behind him, the sounds of Quirrell collapsing, the hiss of something leaving, the terrible thin screech of a presence that was being expelled from its temporary home, and he didn't stop. He didn't run. He walked through the door with the Philosopher's Stone in his closed fist and the rune network still running warm and present along his arm, and when the door was behind him, he let out a very slow, very controlled breath. His legs were shaking slightly. He chose not to address this. He put the stone in his bag, next to Lily's diary, and went to find the others. He found Dumbledore first. The headmaster was in the corridor outside the third-floor room, and he was not alone. McGonagall was there, and Hermione, and Neville, who was standing up under his own power and had his jaw set in a way that suggested he'd refuse to sit down and wait when offered the option. Neville met Harry's eyes across the corridor and the ELD warmth pulsed, a hello, a confirmation, a you're back. Dumbledore looked at Harry and the quality of his gaze was significant. Not alarmed. Not the gaze of someone who'd been taken by surprise. The gaze of someone who'd known something was happening, made a deliberate choice not to intervene, and was now doing the reckoning. You need to get Quirrell out of the chamber below, Harry said. He's alive but the attachment has been severed. He'll need significant medical attention. McGonagall was already moving. Dumbledore had not moved. He was looking at Harry's bag. The stone, he said. In my bag, Harry said. I'll give it to you when we've talked. The corridor went very still in the particular way things went still when someone said something that wasn't supposed to be a negotiation and was. Dumbledore's expression was, he was too disciplined for anything as readable as surprise, but there was a shift in him, a recalibration. Of course, he said, after a moment. I want Neville and Hermione in the room, Harry said. Whatever you tell me, you can tell them. Harry, Hermione said softly, from behind. Is that going to be a problem? Harry asked Dumbledore. No, Dumbledore said. They went to Dumbledore's office. It was, without question, the most interesting room Harry had entered since the chambers below. The walls were covered in portraits of sleeping former headmasters. Instruments of unknown purpose cluttered every surface with the comfortable accumulation of decades. And on the desk, Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes, Harry knew from Lily's diary, sat on his perch and watched Harry with eyes that were gold and ancient and held no particular judgment. Harry sat across the desk from Dumbledore. Neville took the chair to his right. Hermione stood because she processed things better in motion, Harry had noticed, and standing was the polite version of pacing. Tell me, Dumbledore said, what you found. So Harry told him. All of it, not the rune work, not Lily's diary, not the Codex Circle. But Quirrell and the parasitic attachment and Verano's framework and the 5 weeks of observation and the decision to act at Halloween because the conditions were optimal and the waiting had been about information rather than fear. Dumbledore listened without interrupting, which Harry respected. Most adults interrupted. When Harry was done, the office was quiet except for the soft sound of Fawkes settling his feathers. You went down alone, Dumbledore said. Neville and Hermione were with me until the final chamber. You sent them away. I sent them for help and they provided it. He met the blue eyes steadily. The question you're actually asking is whether I should have told you before going. The answer is that I didn't trust the information would be acted on in time. I trust it now, having met you. I didn't know you then. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You're quite extraordinary, you know. People keep saying that, Harry said. I'm 11. I've been working very hard for 5 years. Extraordinary is just what sustained effort looks like from the outside. What you just did, separating the parasitic consciousness from its host through direct signature contact, is advanced magic. Very advanced. More advanced than most of what we teach here. My mother's system, Harry said. It's different from wand craft. More personal. Lily's blood rune work, Dumbledore said, and there was a weight in it, recognition, and grief, and something that might have been guilt, though the quality of the guilt was something Harry filed away to understand later. Yes. He reached into his bag and placed the Philosopher's Stone on the desk between them. I recommend destroying it. The mechanism that created it can be recreated. Flamel has had a very long and apparently satisfying life. The risk of something with that kind of restoration capacity existing while there are still fragments of, he paused. While there are still threats to deal with outweighs the benefit. Dumbledore looked at the stone. Then at Harry. That is, essentially, my own conclusion. I know. You reached it before tonight, that's why it was here with those specific protections rather than at Gringotts. Harry paused. The protections were good, by the way. My compliments to everyone involved. Quirrell still got through most of them, but he's had months of preparation and a millennium of magical knowledge to draw on. McGonagall came back during this. She looked at the 3 students in Dumbledore's office and then at Harry with an expression that was the face of someone who had new information to add to a file she'd been building since a flying lesson. Quirrell is being taken to St. Mungo's, she said. The condition of his hands, she stopped. The attending healer believes he'll recover physically. The magical trauma is more complicated. The parasite won't reattach to him, Harry said. It was expelled through the rejection mechanism. He's free of it. He paused. He'll need to make choices about what he did while it had him. That's his work to do. McGonagall looked at Harry with the expression she'd been doing more frequently since the flying lesson, the one that said she was revising her operating assumptions about something. Mr. Potter, she said, are you injured? My left arm. A graze from a deflected spell. It'll need cleaning. Madame Pomfrey, tomorrow morning is fine, Harry said. I'd like to finish the conversation first. McGonagall pressed her lips together in the way that meant she had strong feelings she was choosing not to express. Dumbledore, Harry noticed, was watching this exchange with the quality of someone learning something. "The stone will be dealt with," Dumbledore said. "Nicholas has agreed. He's had a very long and, as you say, satisfying life." He picked it up carefully. Then he looked at Harry with those blue eyes that had been alive long enough to have seen most things and were now looking at something new. "What would you like in return for this evening's work?" "I don't want anything in return," Harry said. "I did it because it needed doing." "Nevertheless, you've prevented something catastrophic. You've solved a problem that the entire school's protective apparatus had only partially solved. You've demonstrated capabilities that," he chose his words carefully, "that place you in a unique position." "I know that," Harry said. "I've known it for a while. And I'm 11. I'm going to keep learning and keep building, and there will be more conversations like this one as things develop." He paused. "What I'd like from you is honesty. When things are happening that involve me, directly involve me, my history, the reason that thing was in Quirrell in the first place, I'd like to know. I'd like to be part of the conversation instead of the subject of it." The office was very quiet. Neville was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who was fully present and processing. Hermione was looking at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. "That is a fair request," he said. "I will tell you what I can, when I can." "That's a careful answer," Harry said. "It's an honest one. There are things I cannot share with you yet, not because I underestimate you, but because the context required to understand them will take time to build. I am asking for time." Harry considered this. It was a better answer than he'd expected. Not everything he wanted, but it was true, and it acknowledged the negotiation rather than deflecting it. "Fair enough," he said. He stood. Neville stood. Hermione stopped not pacing. "One more thing," Harry said. "Yes." "The detention will presumably receive for being out after hours and accessing restricted areas of the castle. Could it be assigned to a useful purpose? Neville is excellent in the greenhouses and would benefit from time with Professor Sprout. Hermione would be well served in the library with access to the restricted section. And I'd like time with the defense texts from your personal collection, if you'd consider it." McGonagall made a sound that was almost a laugh before she stopped it. Dumbledore's eyes were doing the thing they did that Harry was beginning to understand was the equivalent of a genuine smile, the crinkle at the corners that preceded the beard-obscured version. "I think we can arrange something along those lines," he said. They walked back to Gryffindor Tower through a silent castle, in the deep hours of the night, and Hermione walked between Harry and Neville and said nothing for most of the way, which was unlike her, which meant she was processing something significant. At the portrait hole she stopped. "The thing you did," she said. "In the chamber. With the mirror." "Yes. You pulled the stone out of the mirror's enchantment by reading the desire signature and matching it." She said it like she was testing the statement. "That's not in any of your mother's notes. You worked that out." "Yes." "When?" "About 3 minutes before I did it." She looked at him for a long moment in the torchlight, her expression doing something complicated. "I want to learn the runes," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone stating a conclusion they'd reached and were announcing. "I know," Harry said. "I've been waiting for you to get there." She made a sound that was vaguely indignant. "You could have just asked. I did tell you about it and give you time to investigate and come to your own conclusion." He raised an eyebrow. "That's asking, for someone like you." The indignant sound was louder this time. But she was, very slightly, in the torchlight, with the expression of someone who tried not to and failed, smiling. Neville pulled the portrait open. "Come on," he said. "I need to sit down and also possibly eat something. Emotional battles are very tiring." May came with exams and growing sunlight and the particular energy of a school year winding toward its end, and the weeks between the chamber and the final term had a different quality to them than anything before. Harry had changed, not in the dramatic way of stories where someone goes through something and emerges transformed. More in the way of someone who tested something they'd built and found it held, and could now lean on it differently. There was a confidence in him that had always been there but was now, visible, maybe. Not arrogance. Arrogance was about comparative diminishment, about lifting yourself by lowering others. This was just the quality of someone who knew what they were and wasn't uncertain about it. The teachers had noticed. Flitwick had given him access to the fifth-year charms texts by March, which Harry had been using to cross-reference against Lily's framework and finding interesting points of intersection. McGonagall had stopped asking him to demonstrate and started asking him to explain, which was different and more interesting. She was using him as a resource for understanding advanced theory rather than a pupil to be measured. Even Snape, in potions, had shifted, still cold, still precise, still watching Harry with that unreadable hawk quality, but the questions he'd ask Harry now were testing the boundaries of what Harry knew rather than trying to trip him up. Harry had not, in 5 months, worked out what Snape was about. He was the most complex signature in the school, not in a magical sense, in a personal one. The man's magical presence was powerful and disciplined and precise. But underneath it was something compressed and old and with an emotional density that Harry's Kale reading couldn't parse cleanly. He'd filed Snape under requires more data and kept watching. The Quidditch match against Slytherin had happened in April, and it had been, by any measure, spectacular. Harry had been on the pitch for 11 minutes before he caught the snitch. The Nimbus 2000 was everything Madam Hooch had implied, and the Slytherin Seeker, Terence Higgs, older and technically capable, had been very good. Harry was better because he was reading the whole pitch, not just the snitch and the other Seeker, using the Kale mapping to track magical objects and movement simultaneously in a way that gave him a quarter-second predictive advantage on every turn. The stands had made a sound that Harry suspected could be heard in Hogsmeade. Draco Malfoy had stood in the Slytherin stands with an expression that Harry, catching his eye for a moment during the victory lap, could only describe as reckoning. Not defeat exactly. Something more internal. The expression of a boy who was looking at evidence that didn't fit the model he'd been given and was starting to understand that the model was wrong. Harry had thought, that one's coming around. Slowly, his own way. But coming. He hadn't pushed. He never pushed. He just kept being himself and let the evidence accumulate. Hermione's inscription happened in April as well, on a Thursday evening in the third-floor classroom with Neville and Luna present, and it was different from the other inscriptions in a way Harry hadn't anticipated. The ceremony, not a ceremony, a process, though it had accrued a gravity by the time the fourth member underwent it, was the same. The careful strokes, the blood, the pain that was brief and real and led somewhere warm. Harry had done it to himself 4 years ago alone in a cupboard. He'd done it to Neville and Luna in October. He'd expected Hermione's to be similar. What happened instead was that when the final stroke of ELD settled into Hermione's skin, the connection through the circle didn't just add a fourth note. It changed. The resonance between all 4 of them shifted, Neville's solid stonewall warmth, Luna's sideways brightness, Harry's central steady presence, and Hermione's. What was Hermione's? Sharp. It was the only word. Like a pitch-perfect musical note struck cleanly on the first attempt. Clear and precise and somehow illuminating, the way a beam of light through a prism showed colors that had been there in the white all along. The rune network glowed. Not metaphorically, the marks on all 4 of them lit up briefly, a warm amber that faded in 3 seconds, and left behind a silence in the classroom that was the silence of something significant having just occurred. "Oh," Hermione said, holding her arm and looking at the mark with an expression Harry had never seen on her before, not the analytical hunger, not the controlled precision. Something open. Something that had been surprised by its own depth. "Oh, I didn't expect, I know," Harry said. "You could feel that?" "You can feel," she looked at Neville. "At Luna." "I can feel all 3 of you." Yes, Luna said serenely. Like, Neville is very warm, that's generally agreed upon, Neville said. And Luna is, sideways, Harry offered. Yes, actually. That's exactly it. She looked at Harry. And you're, what? Harry asked, genuinely curious. He'd never been able to feel his own signature from the outside. Hermione thought for a moment. Like a room full of lit candles, she said. Warm, and a lot of them, and they're all deliberately placed. Harry sat with that for a while. He thought it was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to him. The circle met 3 times a week now, officially in the 3rd floor classroom, though Luna had started coming to the Gryffindor common room sometimes because nobody in Gryffindor had the confidence to ask her why she was there, and she found the fire comfortable. They worked on theory together. Hermione had, within a month of joining, already pushed past Lily's foundational framework in several directions and was developing what she called a grammatical theory of runic combination, the idea that the geometric structures Harry had discovered were actually expressing a more fundamental logic, that the triangle and diamond structures weren't the only possibilities but were examples of a deeper principle of mutual support. It's not the geometry, she said one evening, surrounded by 3 books and 2 notebooks and a diagram she'd been redrawing for an hour. The geometry is the expression. The principle is, every node must have at least 2 other nodes supporting it. That's why the chain linking doesn't work. A chain only has 1 support per node, the one behind it. A triangle gives you 2. A diamond gives you 3. A pentagon, I tried a pentagon last summer, Harry said. She looked up. And? Stable. I didn't know why. I thought it was just the shape. It's not the shape. It's the minimum support condition. She wrote something fast and underlined it. Which means you could in theory construct any polygon as long as each node maintains at least 2 connections. Which means the maximum size of a rune network is, she stopped. Wrote something. Stared at it. Harry. Is this what I think it is? He leaned over and looked at the mathematics she'd worked out. Yes, he said. The network could theoretically scale to any number of people. Yes. The Codex Circle, she said slowly, has no theoretical upper limit on membership. The classroom was quiet. Neville looked at Harry with the expression of someone who'd been standing next to something and just understood its scale. Luna folded her magazine, which she almost never did. No, Harry said. It doesn't. The end of term brought the feast, and the House Cup announcement, and the specific social reorganization of 200 students who'd spent a year establishing hierarchies and were about to spend 2 months apart. The points had been awarded for the 3rd floor incident, Harry, Neville, and Hermione, 60 points each for what Dumbledore called outstanding courage and intelligence demonstrated in the prevention of significant harm to the school. Luna had received 40 points for significant contribution to the resolution of a dangerous situation, which Harry suspected was Dumbledore being deliberately vague about what exactly Luna had contributed, which had been the intelligence work that Harry had been feeding her throughout the year and which she'd been organizing with the precise, slightly sideways filing system of her remarkable mind. Gryffindor won the House Cup. At the end of your feast, Harry sat between Neville and Hermione and watched the hall with the Kale sense open, mapping signatures the way he'd mapped them on the first night. He knew them all differently now, 5 months of living with these people, eating with them, arguing with them in classes, watching them sleep in dormitories and stress about homework and be occasionally magnificent and occasionally terrible. He thought about what Hermione had said, that the network had no theoretical upper limit. He thought about what Lily had written on page 1. Magic that connects instead of divides. He thought about the stone, now destroyed, and the thin cold voice in the dark chamber, and the fact that a fragment of something very old and very dangerous was still out there, expelled from Quirrell, looking for its next host. He thought about the boxes in Lily's vault at Gringotts. For when you need it. You'll know. Not yet. Almost. Draco Malfoy, at the Slytherin table, caught Harry's eye across the hall. The expression on his face was no longer the one Harry had catalogued on the train, the carefully performed certainty of someone who'd been given a fixed role and was playing it. It was something still assembling. Something that didn't have a name yet. Harry nodded at him, brief and genuine. Draco, after a moment, nodded back. Luna, beside Neville now, having relocated from the Ravenclaw table to sit with people she actually wanted to be near, looked at Harry with her clear grey eyes. "You're planning something for next year," she said. "I'm always planning something," Harry said. "Something bigger than this year." "This year was foundation," Harry said. "The architecture of what comes next is still being built." She looked at the hall, all 4 tables, all the noise and color of it, all the signatures he'd been learning to read. "It's going to be remarkable," she said, with the same calm certainty she brought to everything. "I hope so," Harry said. The candles in the great hall burned steadily overhead, hundreds of them, deliberately placed. Chapter 5. What the Codex demands. The summer between first and second year was the longest Harry had felt since the one he'd spent in the cupboard learning to find the warmth behind his sternum. Not unpleasantly long. Productively long. The difference was having things to do that mattered. He'd retrieved 2 of the sealed boxes from Lily's vault on the last day of term, before the Hogwarts Express. Hermione had come with him, she'd offered and he'd accepted, which was how most things between them worked, a mutual recognition of utility that had quietly become something else without either of them making a formal announcement about it. They'd taken the Gringotts cart down to Vault 687, and Harry had stood before the boxes with their neat handwritten labels, and Hermione had stood slightly behind him with the respectful quiet of someone who understood that this particular moment was not hers. He'd taken the 2 marked Theory, Advanced Applications and Network Architecture, unpublished. He'd left the others. Not yet. On the train back to London, with Neville dozing across from them and Luna reading an upside-down Quibbler, Harry had opened the first box. Inside was a stack of parchment, dense, technical, written in Lily's quick hand with the concentration of someone who'd had a lot to say and not enough time, and a note on top. "Harry, if you're ready for this, you've already built past my published framework. The work in this box is where I was going. It's incomplete. Finish it." Mum. He'd read the first 12 pages before the train reached London. Hermione had read over his shoulder for 8 of them. By the time they reached King's Cross, she'd said 4 things. "This assumes the network can generate emergent properties," then, "That can't be right, can it?" then, "No, wait, it absolutely can," and finally a silence that was not the absence of speech but the presence of rapid thought. "Come find me in August," Harry said, "at the barrier. Bring everything you've read by then." "Obviously," she said, which was probably the warmest version of agreement she was capable of. Back at Privet Drive, Harry had a different relationship with the house than he'd had in every summer before. It was still the Dursleys' house. Vernon still turned red at dinner and Petunia still cleaned things that weren't dirty and Dudley still consumed everything in a 10-foot radius. But Harry occupied a different territory in it now, not the cupboard, which he'd been moved out of the previous summer when Hogwarts' first letter had apparently alarmed Petunia into giving him Dudley's second bedroom, and not the anxious margins of a child waiting to be small enough not to be noticed. He took up appropriate space. He was polite and direct and he didn't ask for much and he didn't apologize for what he did ask for, and the Dursleys had reached some working accommodation with this in the way that people reach accommodation with things they can't change and have decided not to fight. Petunia, specifically, had been doing something that Harry was cautiously interpreting as decency. It started small, the slice of cake on his plate in July of the previous year, unremarked. Then in August she'd mentioned, while he was reading at the kitchen table, that the library on Magnolia Crescent had a good science section and they let you take out 4 books at a time. She'd said it to the window, not to him, and left the room before he could respond. He'd gone to the library the next morning and spent 4 hours in the science section and come back with books on chemistry, physics, and one on the mathematics of crystal lattice structures that turned out to be directly relevant to his rune geometry work in a way that kept him up until 2 in the morning making connections. He'd left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Thank you for the library suggestion. It was useful." He'd signed it with his name. She'd never mentioned it again. But the information had kept coming, small and indirect. A TV program about historical linguistics she'd happened to mention was on. A newspaper article about recent discoveries in electromagnetic field theory she'd left on the table, not addressed to anyone. He thought about Lily writing she was brilliant at chemistry. He thought about the small magical flicker he'd felt from her, once. He thought about what it was to have a talent for something and be told it wasn't for you. He was too young and too uncertain to fix that. He filed it carefully and thought, later. When I know more. The letter arrived in July, which was expected, but the content was not. He'd been waiting for the usual Hogwarts notification, supply list updates, elective choices for third year were 2 years off, but Lily's notes had been emphatic about preparation, but the envelope that Hedwig dropped on his desk on a Thursday morning was not Hogwarts stationery. It was cream parchment, personal rather than institutional, sealed with a wax stamp he didn't recognize, 2 serpents intertwined around a staff. Inside, in a precise, slanted hand, Mr. Potter, I am writing at some personal risk to my reputation and possibly my employment. I am Andromeda Tonks, née Black. My daughter Nymphadora is beginning her Auror training this autumn. I was a contemporary of your mother's at Hogwarts, in Slytherin, 2 years her senior. I knew her work on blood rune harmonics. I knew it was extraordinary and I knew what happened to it after she died. I have recently learned, through channels I'll describe in person if you're willing to meet, that the paper Boris Finkley rejected in 1976 has been referenced in 3 separate ministry research documents in the last decade, uncredited. The work wasn't buried because it was insufficient. It was buried because someone found it too useful to let circulate freely. I think you deserve to know this. I also think you may be doing something with it that the relevant people would prefer to prevent. I would like to help, if you'll let me. Tonks. Harry read the letter twice. Then he held it near the window and used Kale to check the parchment, old habit, checking correspondence for tracking enchantments or compulsion work. Clean. Nothing on it except the faint ambient signature of the writer, which was strong and complex and had the specific quality of a Black family magical signature, dense, layered, ancient, overlaid with something that had been deliberately cultivated in a different direction. Like a river that had found its own course. He wrote back that evening, Mrs. Tonks, I'm willing to meet. Name the time and place. H.P. They met in a small cafe in Diagon Alley in the last week of July. Andromeda Tonks was a tall woman with dark hair going grey at the temples and the particular quality of composure that came from having made a very difficult choice a long time ago and not regretting it. She looked at Harry across a small table with cups of tea between them and said, without preamble, you have her eyes. You also have something she didn't have at 11, which is the quality of someone who's been running their own operation for years. I have been, Harry said. The rune work. Yes. How far have you taken it past her notes? He told her enough. Not everything. He'd learned from Dumbledore's example that what I can share when I can share it was a legitimate position, but enough that she could see the shape of what he'd built and enough to watch her reaction, which was one of the best pieces of information he got from most conversations. Her reaction was, precise assessment, visible excitement that she was controlling, and then a shift into something harder. The ministry documents, she said. The uncredited references. I can show you them, I have copies. Someone in the Department of Mysteries has been working on a rune-based magical suppression theory for at least 8 years that draws directly from Lily's framework. The application they're developing it's designed to bind magical signatures. Permanently. Harry was quiet. Bind them, he said. Suppress the individual signature quality. Reduce all magical output to an undifferentiated baseline. She held his gaze. The theory, in Lily's work, explains why signatures are unique and why that uniqueness matters. The application they're building inverts that entirely. They want to eliminate the uniqueness. Why? Control, she said. Undifferentiated magic is controllable magic. Individual signature magic is hard to monitor, Harry said. Hard to restrict. Hard to attribute to specific people if they work it properly. Yes. He thought about Ain, which had been making him difficult to magically detect since he was 6. He thought about the fact that no ministry trace had flagged his 5 years of magical practice at Privet Drive. The Ain rune wasn't hiding him from the trace by actively blocking it. It was making his magic so aligned with his own signature that it didn't register as the ambient undirected magic the trace was calibrated to detect. Individual signature magic was, by its nature, off the ministry's radar. Someone had understood this. Someone had decided this was a problem. "I want to see the documents," Harry said. She slid a folder across the table. He spent 2 hours in that cafe reading ministry research memos he was not supposed to have seen, with Andromeda Tonks drinking tea across from him and occasionally pointing out specific passages, and by the time he left he had a more complete picture of the political landscape than he'd had from Lily's diary, which had been written in 1981. The world had kept moving. The interests that wanted magic controlled had gotten more organized. He walked back through Diagon Alley and thought, the Codex Circle needs to be larger. He went to Hermione's house in August. She lived in a neat terraced house in Hampstead with 2 parents who were dentists and who had clearly been working very hard at being normal about the fact that their daughter was a witch. Her father offered him biscuits with the anxious hospitality of someone who decided to be welcoming and was going to commit to it fully. Her mother asked him 3 questions about Hogwarts that were clearly the product of advanced preparation and then relaxed into genuine curiosity, which Harry liked. Hermione's room was what he'd expected and slightly more than that, every surface covered in organized stacks of books, a chalkboard sheet had installed on one wall covered in her small, precise handwriting, and in the corner, a new stack of parchment that he recognized as her runic grammar project from the summer. "I've been working on the emergent properties question," she said, before he'd entirely sat down. She went to the chalkboard. "Your mother's ELD rune creates a connection. We've established the connection has no theoretical upper limit on participants. But what we haven't mapped is the quality of the emergent effects at scale." Meaning 2 people connected by ELD have a small amplification effect. 4 people, us, have a larger one, but not exactly twice as large. The scaling isn't linear. She pointed at a graph she'd drawn. "I've been trying to model it with what data we have, our own subjective experience of the circle's effect, combined with my theory of mutual support geometry, and if the model is right, the amplification effect is approximately exponential," Harry said. She turned. "You've run the math." "Not formally. But the geometry implied it." He looked at her chalkboard. 6 people wouldn't be twice as powerful as 3. They'd be something like 4 times. "More than that," she said, and her voice had the quality of controlled excitement he'd come to recognize in her, the voice that meant she'd found something real and was managing her reaction to it. "The mutual support principle means every additional node strengthens all existing connections, not just the ones directly adjacent to it. The growth rate is," she wrote a formula. "Have you seen this before?" He studied it. "No. But it looks right." "It's not just amplification," she said. "At large enough scale, the network would start developing properties that aren't present in any individual member. Not telepathy, not hive mind, but something like shared perception. Shared processing. The individual members would still be entirely themselves, but the circle as a collective would be capable of things no individual within it could manage alone." Harry looked at the formula and thought about what Andromeda Tonks had told him about the Ministry's suppression project. About undifferentiated magic. About the specific things that individual signature magic could do that they wanted to prevent. "They'd be afraid of this," he said. "Yes," Hermione said. "If it works at scale, it's the opposite of what the suppression project wants. It's not just individual signatures being powerful. It's individual signatures amplifying each other in ways that have nothing to do with institutional or ministry-sanctioned structures." She paused. "It would be completely ungovernable by existing regulatory frameworks." "Good," Harry said. She looked at him steadily. "I said that neutrally. You said it like you're pleased about it. I am pleased about it. The existing regulatory frameworks are built to concentrate power in specific hands. A network that operates outside them isn't criminal, it's just genuinely independent. He paused. Lily built this to connect people and make them stronger together. The ministry wants to make everyone's magic the same so they can control all of it. These two things are going to be in conflict. I know, Hermione said. I've been thinking about that since Gringotts. She put the chalk down and leaned against her desk. How large do you want to build it? I want everyone who should be in it to be in it, Harry said. Not for power. For protection. For the thing it actually is, magic that says you're not alone. He paused. But also yes, partially for power, because we're going to need it and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She nodded once, the nod of someone who's made a decision and is done deliberating. Who's next? Fred and George Weasley, Harry said. She blinked. The twins? They've been watching me since the Halloween incident. They know something's going on and they're too clever not to figure it out eventually. Better to bring them in than have them figure it out from the outside. They're pranksters. They're strategists who use humor as cover because it's safer than being taken seriously. Harry had watched the twins for the full second half of the year. They map everything. They know Hogwarts better than most of the staff. They have information networks across every house and half the student population. And they're genuinely loyal, not to institutions, but to people they decide are worth it. He paused. They're exactly what the circle needs. Hermione considered this for a moment. Who else? Daphne Greengrass. A longer pause. She's Slytherin. Yes. She's a pureblood from a family with ministry connections. Yes. Harry met her eyes. She's also been systematically undermining Draco Malfoy's social authority in Slytherin since November. Quietly, carefully, without being visible about it. She's been doing it because she disagrees with the direction Malfoy pulls the house and she's intelligent enough to work around him rather than confront him. He paused. Luna found this out through her own methods, which I trust completely. Luna talks to the Slytherin first years, Hermione said, which was said with the tone of someone who'd accepted Luna's methods as an empirical reality. I didn't know that. Luna talks to everyone who's been made to feel like they're on the outside, Harry said. Slytherin has more of those than people think. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, Draco Malfoy. Not yet. Harry said it without hesitation. He's not ready. He's still dismantling something before he can build something new. Pushing him before he's done with that would just create resistance. He paused. But eventually, yes. I think so. You're very patient with him for someone he was awful to on the train. He wasn't awful on the train. He gave me the opening social hierarchy speech he'd been taught and then adjusted when I didn't respond to it. That's actually more intelligence than most people show at 11. Harry paused. He's trying to figure out who he is without the script his father gave him. I know what that's like, a bit. I had no script at all. Hermione looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between understanding and something else, warmer, that neither of them had named. All right, she said. She turned back to the chalkboard. So, Fred and George, Daphne Greengrass, and eventually Malfoy. Who else? I don't know yet, Harry said. The circle tells me, if I'm paying attention. The right people make themselves known. She wrote Weasley x2, Greengrass on the board, and under it, emergent properties at n equals 7. Harry looked at the question marks and thought about Andromeda Tonks and Ministry suppression projects and the thin cold voice in a dark chamber that had said I underestimated you with the quality of something that was noting a mistake for future correction. Hermione, he said. Thank you. For spending your summer on this. She looked slightly surprised, then did the thing where she filed it and moved on. That was her version of receiving something without knowing what to do with it. "It's interesting work," she said. "I know. Still." She looked at the formula on the chalkboard. "Go home and finish reading your mother's second box," she said. "Then tell me what you find." He smiled, the genuine one, the one he didn't give very often. "Obviously," he said. September 1st came the way September always did, abruptly, with the feeling of a page turning. The Hogwarts Express was different this year than last. Harry moved through King's Cross with the ease of someone who'd done it before, but also with the Kale rune mapping the crowd, noting who was there. The Weasley family in their usual cluster, Arthur Weasley with his air of a man perpetually delighted by everything, Molly Weasley with her air of a woman managing a small weather system, and a cascade of red-haired children at various stages of the journey. Fred and George caught his eye across the platform and did a simultaneous double-take so precisely synchronized that it was almost certainly intentional, then grinned with the energy of people who'd been waiting. He'd owed them in August. Brief, direct, "I have a proposition. Find me on the train." He'd signed it and waited. They'd replied within 2 hours. "We were hoping you'd say that." FNG. He found Neville and Luna and Hermione, and they found a large compartment near the front of the train, and 20 minutes after departure Fred and George arrived with the comfortable chaos of people who were always exactly as loud as the space required. "Right," said Fred, closing the compartment door behind them. "What's the proposition?" Harry told them. Not quickly, he took the time it required, because Fred and George, for all their jokes, were people who worked with information and deserved accurate information to work with. He explained Blood Rune Craft, the ELD connection, the Codex Circle. He was specific about what the connection was and wasn't, about the permanence of the inscription, about the fact that the decision was entirely theirs. They listened without interrupting, which was, Harry suspected, a rare mode for them. Fred's expression moved from grinning to attentive to something serious and genuine. George went still in the way that very active people go still when something lands. When Harry finished, Fred looked at George. George looked at Fred. It was a conversation that required no words and took about 4 seconds. "We want to ask one thing first," George said. "Ask," Harry said. "The Halloween thing last year. The chamber. The you-know-who situation." Fred leaned forward. "We heard things. Third hand, through our sources, which are considerable," George added. "And what we heard suggested that Harry Potter walked into that alone and came out with the Philosopher's Stone in his pocket and told Dumbledore what was what." "Approximately," Harry said. "You were 11, Fred said. "Still am, technically." George snorted. "The thing we want to know," Fred said, and his voice was still that serious register that suited him differently than the jokes did, "is whether this circle of yours is something you're building because you need people, or because you actually think we're worth having." The compartment was quiet. Harry looked at both of them. "I think you're the most wasted resource in Hogwarts," he said. "You've spent 2 years playing small because it's safer. You know things about the school, about people, about how information moves that nobody else knows. You're funny because you're intelligent and intelligence is less threatening with a punchline attached." He paused. "I'm asking you in because you're worth asking in. Not because I need warm bodies." Fred and George processed this. Then George said, "When Lily Potter wrote about the rune system, the connection, she said it was magic that connects instead of divides." Harry went still. "How do you know that phrasing?" "Dad," Fred said simply. "He worked with your father briefly, before everything. James Potter talked about your mum's work. Dad remembered it. Arthur Weasley had kept that for 11 years. Harry thought about that and what it said about Arthur Weasley. "Yes," Harry said. "That's what it is." Then yes, Fred and George said, together, in the way they said things that mattered. Harry took out the inscription materials, he'd prepared for this, he always prepared, and worked carefully, twice, and when the ELD rune settled into both of them the circle expanded again and the warmth in Harry's wrist shifted into something larger, richer, more complex. 6 members. The amplification effect in Hermione's formula was already, Harry could feel it, different. Something at the edge of the network was developing a quality he hadn't felt before, a kind of awareness that wasn't his and wasn't any single person's but was the circle thinking, at some level, collectively. He'd tell Hermione about it tonight. Fred looked at his wrist. At the mark. At Harry. What do we do now? We go back to Hogwarts, Harry said. And we build. Daphne Greengrass was harder. She found him first, which he'd expected from what Luna had told him. 3 days into term, in a corridor between Transfiguration and lunch, she fell into step beside him with the ease of someone who'd planned the intercept down to the precise stretch of corridor that was empty enough for a private conversation. She was taller than Harry by an inch, which she apparently found irritating, and had the specific quality of self-possession that came from growing up in a family where everything was political and learning to work with that rather than be worked by it. She was not, Harry had decided from a year of observation, anything like the surface she presented to most people. Potter, she said. Greengrass, he said. You've been building something. Yes. I want to know what. He looked at her sideways as they walked. Why? Because it's clearly significant, and significant things in Hogwarts tend to either go very well or very badly, and I prefer to know which before I'm affected by the fallout. She paused. Also because the circle of people around you is notably composed of individuals who are, in their respective contexts, underestimated. And I have feelings about being underestimated. You've been managing the Slytherin social architecture for a year to limit Malfoy's influence, Harry said. She didn't miss a step. You know about that? Yes. How? Luna. A pause. Luna Lovegood knows things she shouldn't know and I've stopped being surprised by it. She glanced at him. Is she actually prescient or does she just talk to everyone? Both, I think, Harry said. They're not mutually exclusive. They stopped at a junction in the corridor. Daphne looked at him with the assessing quality of someone making a final decision. Tell me about what you're building, she said. All of it. I'll tell you whether I'm in. So he told her. Standing in the corridor junction, low-voiced, complete. The rune system, the connection, the circle's current members, the emergent properties Hermione had theorized, the Andromeda Tonks meeting and the Ministry Suppression Project. She listened with absolute stillness. When he was done, the Ministry's Suppression Project. You have documentation. Yes. My father sits on the relevant oversight committee, she said. I've seen references to it. I didn't know the theoretical basis. Now you do. Lily Potter's work, inverted. Her voice was flat with something controlled underneath it. Used as a tool to eliminate the very thing she built it to celebrate. She looked at the corridor ahead of them. That's actually disgusting. Yes. She held out her arm. Not the wrist, the inner forearm, sleeve already pushed up with the practiced motion of someone who'd made decisions before and knew the feel of commitment. I have conditions, she said. Tell me, Harry said. I don't disappear into your structure. I stay myself, Daphne Greengrass, Slytherin, my family's connections intact. The Codex Circle doesn't make me a Gryffindor. It makes me someone with a Gryffindor alliance and everything that doesn't require me to give up. She met his eyes. I can be more useful to you as myself than as a converted version of myself. I know, Harry said. That's why I was going to ask you eventually. I'm glad you found me first. He paused. The circle isn't about conversion. It's about connection. You'd be joining it as Daphne Greengrass. That's exactly who I'm asking for. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then, do it. He inscribed ELD carefully, precisely, and when the mark settled into her skin and the warmth expanded through the circle, he felt her signature join the network, cool and precise and layered, like very good architecture. Something that had been designed to stand. 7. The emergent quality at the edge of the network was now unmistakable. Something breathing, larger than any one of them. The defense class with Professor Lockhart was, Harry had decided by the end of the first lesson, a masterpiece of form over substance. The man was spectacular looking, enthusiastically self-promotional, and in possession of a defense curriculum that was essentially a guided tour of Gilderoy Lockhart's own published works. His magical ability was, Harry had run Kale over him on day one and gotten a signature that was genuinely powerful but entirely unfocused, like a very strong light with no lens. Raw ability that had never been properly directed. The interesting thing about Lockhart was not his incompetence. It was the specific quality of the incompetence, the way it was perfectly calibrated to appear like competence to people who didn't know what competence actually looked like. He'd spent years doing this. He'd gotten very good at it. Harry watched him from the middle of the classroom and thought, someone taught you that. Not the magic, the performance. Someone taught you the performance was enough. Mr. Potter, Lockhart said, with the specific enthusiasm of someone who found celebrity adjacency thrilling. Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate. I'd rather listen, Harry said. I learn better that way. Lockhart faltered slightly, then redirected toward a more receptive target. The class moved on. Hermione, 3 seats away, was writing notes with the focused intensity of someone who was going to need them later regardless of the source quality. Neville was watching the front of the class with the expression of someone giving the situation a fair chance. After class, in the corridor, he's a fraud, Neville said. Substantial fraud, Harry agreed. What's his signature like? Neville asked. He didn't have Kale, but he'd developed a good intuition from being in the circle. Strong, unfocused. He has the power but not the architecture to use it. Harry paused. Someone's going to get hurt in his class if anything actually dangerous happens and he has to actually respond. Should we tell someone? Who? Dumbledore hired him. Harry thought about Dumbledore's careful honesty and the implicit acknowledgement that there were things he wasn't ready to share yet. I think Dumbledore knows something is off. I think Dumbledore had reasons for hiring him that I don't have access to yet. He paused. We don't need Lockhart to teach us defense. We'll teach ourselves. In the classroom? Hermione asked, appearing from the direction of the library with her Lockhart notes and a second book already open. In the classroom, Harry confirmed. The third-floor classroom had become something more than a meeting room by October. It had a permanent array of Harry's Kale mapping on the walls, a running sketch of the school's magical architecture that he updated whenever he noticed changes, and Hermione's chalkboard, relocated with Neville's help in September, covered in the evolving grammar of runic theory. Fred and George had contributed what they called an intelligence annex, which was a corkboard covered in notes about who was where in the school at what times and what was going on that wasn't making it to official channels. The board currently had, among other things, Myrtle's bathroom, something wrong, water incidents increasing since late September. And, Filch in a mood, something he found/lost/broke, unknown. And, Slytherin Quidditch practice rescheduled twice, internal conflict, Draco involved. Harry looked at the Myrtle's bathroom note. How long has the water thing been going on? Since the 23rd, Fred said. George talked to Myrtle. George talked to Myrtle. She's lonely, George said, without any particular judgment in it. She told me the pipes have been making a sound she doesn't like. Says it's the same sound she heard the night she died. The classroom went quiet. Harry looked at the board. Then at Hermione. Then at the floor, where his thoughts were doing fast, careful work. What year did Myrtle die? He said. 50 years ago, approximately, Hermione said. She was already at the shelves of books she'd brought up over the course of the year, pulling something. There was an incident, the Chamber of Secrets rumor. In 1942 or 43. A student died, the school nearly closed, a student was expelled for supposedly keeping a monster. She found the page. The expelled student was Hagrid. Hagrid didn't open anything, Harry said. Obviously, Hermione said. But something was opened, Harry said. And now something is making the same sounds. He looked at the map of the school's magical architecture on the wall. There are parts of the castle's foundation layer that I can feel but can't read clearly. Old things, pre-Hogwarts old. Deep in the structure. He moved to the wall and pointed. Here. Under the girls' bathroom on the second floor. And here, this corridor, and this one. They connect. Daphne, who'd been in the classroom reading and doing the Codex's version of intelligence work, which for her meant cross-referencing political documents she'd acquired through her family connections, stood up and came to look. A passage system below the school. Older than the school, Harry said. The enchantment signature is different, not Hogwarts style, more like foundational settlement magic, the kind built into a place rather than onto it. He traced the lines on his map. Whatever's down there has been dormant. Something woke it up. Fred and George looked at each other. We've mapped most of the secret passages, Fred said. There are 7 main ones and a few minor ones. But there's a section of the dungeons, below the Slytherin common room, where our mapping stops. Like the space isn't there, but the building suggests it should be. Show me, Harry said. The thing in the pipes made its move on the 31st of October. Harry had been expecting it. Not the specific mechanism, a basilisk, which he'd confirmed through 3 weeks of cross-referencing the magical signature in the depths of the castle against bestiary records in the library's restricted section, but the timing. Something about the anniversary, about the specific quality of the magical disturbance in October, had suggested the end of the month. He was on his way to the third-floor classroom with Neville and Hermione when the ELD warmth flared, not from the circle, from outside it, a general disturbance in the school's ambient magic that his network was sensitive enough to register. He stopped. Something's happening, Neville said. On the second floor, Harry said, feeling the direction of it. The bathroom. They found the message on the wall before anyone else did, because they were moving toward the disturbance rather than away from it. The writing was in something dark and thick on the stone, the Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Mrs. Norris was hanging from a torch bracket, rigid, eyes filmed white. Harry looked at the writing. At the cat. At the direction the magical disturbance was coming from, deeper, descending, something that had moved through the pipes and was now below. He put his hand on the wall. Kale opened fully. The signature below was enormous, ancient, cold, entirely alien, moving with the slow deliberate purpose of something that had been waiting for 50 years and was now oriented. The basilisk's magical signature was unlike anything he'd mapped before, not because it was powerful, though it was, but because of its age. It had been here since before most of the people in this building were born, sleeping in the foundation layer of Hogwarts, waiting to be aimed. Alive, Harry said, about Mrs. Norris. She's been petrified, not killed. The basilisk's killing gaze requires direct eye contact, she caught a reflection. Hermione said, how do you know it's a basilisk? The signature. I've been checking it against bestiary records for 3 weeks. You've known for 3 weeks, I've suspected. Tonight confirms it. He turned from the wall. Neville, I need you to do something for me. Neville, whose face had done a journey through several emotions and arrived at determined, straightened. Yes. Find Fred and George. Tell them, the thing in the pipes is confirmed, basilisk, second-floor bathroom, moved through the plumbing after the petrification. They'll know what to do with the information. The twins had their own intelligence threads across the school that Harry trusted to activate appropriately. Daphne? Hermione said. She'll already know something's happened, Harry said. She's woven into the Slytherin information network well enough that any unusual movement in the house will reach her. He thought. The heir's message, enemies of the heir. Someone in the school is controlling this. The basilisk is a weapon, not an independent actor. It was placed here by someone who wanted it available. He paused. 50 years ago, that was Tom Riddle. Now there's a fragment of Riddle still operational somewhere, an object, Hermione said. A vessel. If the fragment in Quirrell was attached to a person, this one is attached to an object. Something that can possess someone or direct someone to open the chamber. Her voice was fast and certain. A diary. Harry looked at her. A 50-year-old diary, she said. Would be the right kind of object. Riddle was a student here 50 years ago. He'd have had access to the chamber then. He'd have wanted to preserve the ability to use it again. She met his eyes. Where would he hide something like that? Somewhere a student would find it and not recognize what it was, Harry said. Or somewhere a student would find it and be compelled to use it. He thought about the quality of the resonance he'd been feeling from the depths of the castle. Not just the basilisk, something directing the basilisk. A presence with the same thin cold quality as the voice in the chamber last year. Someone has it. Someone in the school. Footsteps from the corridor. Students coming from the feast, drawn by the noise or the instinct of a crowd. Not long before teachers arrived. We need to not be here when Filch arrives, Neville said. Go, Harry said. They went. In 3 directions, which was the correct answer to the question of how you left an incident scene without looking like an incident scene, which was a thing Harry had thought about because he thought about all logistics. Moving through the castle toward the 3rd-floor classroom, Harry put his hand in his bag and felt the familiar soft warmth of Lily's diary through its cloth wrapping. He thought about a boy 50 years ago who'd made himself into an object because he was afraid of not existing. He thought about the boxes in Lily's vault and the one he hadn't opened yet. He thought about the network running warm and present along his arm, 7 people lit up like windows across a dark city. Someone had a diary that was eating them alive. He was going to find it.